Imagine boarding a routine flight, expecting a few hours in the air, only to land decades later, your plane, your crew, and every passenger seemingly untouched by time. On June 21, 1955, Pan Am Flight 914 vanished from the skies over the Caribbean, leaving no trace and baffling investigators. Then, in a story that sounds impossible, it reappeared 37 years later, as if the intervening decades had been erased. How could a modern airliner disappear from one era and emerge in another without warning, explanation, or warning? In this documentary, we explore not just the flight itself, but a series of baffling time-slip events, from missing planes and ships to unexplained journeys through decades. These are real stories, documented yet inexplicable, that challenge everything we think we know about time. Join us as we dive into the chilling mysteries of the sky and the hidden anomalies that defy explanation. The mysterious arrival of Pan Am Flight 914. The morning was clear over New York's LaGuardia Airport when PanAmerican Flight 914 prepared for departure. It was July 2, 1955, and the Douglas DC-4 sat waiting on the tarmac, its silver fuselage glinting under the summer sun. On board were 57 passengers and a crew of 4, all headed for Miami on what should have been an easy 3-hour flight along the East Coast. The crew had gone through the usual checks, the passengers were settled in their seats, and the engines rumbled to life as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. There was nothing in the weather reports to suggest trouble, and the last messages from the flight deck were routine, calm, and unremarkable. Once the plane lifted into the air, it climbed steadily and followed its planned route south, its position marked on radar as it moved along the coastline. Air traffic controllers monitored the progress without incident until, suddenly, the blip representing Flight 914 vanished from the screen. There had been no distress calls, no warnings of mechanical problems, and no signs of deviation from the flight path. In a matter of seconds, the aircraft was gone, and attempts to re-establish radio contact failed. Search and rescue teams were scrambled, sweeping over the waters and marshlands between New York and Miami. Not a trace was found, no debris, no oil slicks, no emergency signals. It was as though the aircraft had simply been erased from the sky. Families waited for updates in crowded terminals and hotel lobbies, clinging to the hope that the flight had made an emergency landing somewhere remote. The airline issued statements that were careful and vague, acknowledging the disappearance but offering no explanation. Weeks turned into months, and then into years, with no breakthrough. The case quietly faded into the long list of unsolved aviation mysteries, and for many it became a chapter best left closed. But for those who had lost loved ones on Flight 914, the absence of answers only deepened the wound. Decades later, far from the original flight path, an air traffic control tower in Caracas, Venezuela, was working through a routine morning in 1992 when something unusual appeared on their radar. It was an inbound aircraft, but the transponder signal was not one they recognized. Controllers tracked it as it approached the airport and prepared to make contact. When the voice came through the radio, it was calm but confused. The pilot identified himself as Captain Victor Grubbs of PanAmerican Flight 914, requesting permission to land from New York to Miami. The controllers exchanged quick glances. The information made no sense. The flight number, the origin, and the destination matched nothing currently in their schedules. Yet the aircraft was right there, descending steadily toward the runway. As the DC-4 touched down and rolled along the tarmac, ground crew members moved to meet it. The first thing they noticed was its appearance. The livery was that of Pan Am, but the design looked decades out of date. The colours faded in a way that suggested age, not recent wear. When the pilot opened his window to speak with the marshalling crew, his words only deepened the strangeness. He asked, in complete seriousness, what year it was. The ground crew, taken aback, replied that it was 1992. According to later accounts, the pilot's face drained of colour. Without waiting for more questions, he reportedly started the engines again, taxied toward the far end of the runway, and took off before anyone could stop him. Witnesses claimed the plane lifted into the sky and was gone within minutes, leaving behind only a few scattered papers that had blown from the cockpit during its brief stop. Among them was a small calendar from 1955 and a passenger manifest with names that matched those recorded in the original disappearance. The incident became the subject of hushed conversations among the airport staff, some of whom were convinced it had really happened, while others dismissed it as a rumour fueled by confusion and memory's tendency to play tricks. Official records from the airport that day were later said to have been altered or misplaced, and PanAmerican World Airways, which had ceased operations the year before, offered no comment, adding another layer of silence to the mystery. For those who believe the event occurred exactly as described, the implications are staggering. How could an aircraft vanish in 1955 and reappear in 1992 without a single sign of aging, without any of its passengers or crew realizing that decades had passed? Some theories point to the possibility of a time slip, a sudden and unexplained shift into another moment in history, whether caused by natural forces we don't yet understand or by something else entirely. In this view, the flight may have travelled through a kind of invisible corridor, skipping over years as easily as crossing a state line. Others suggest a more mundane but equally baffling explanation, involving misidentification, altered records, and the blending of multiple aviation incidents into a single enduring legend. Skeptics note that much of the Pan Am Flight 914 story comes from second-hand reports and sensationalized articles, often without verifiable primary sources. They argue that without physical evidence, wreckage, maintenance logs, or first-person testimony from passengers, the story sits in the hazy borderland between truth and folklore. Yet even those who doubt its literal truth often admit that something unusual seems to lie at the heart of the account, something that resists easy explanation and continues to surface in retellings across decades. The idea of stepping onto a plane and arriving not just in another city but in another time touches a deep and unsettling part of the human imagination. We live by clocks and calendars, by the certainty that time moves forward in a steady, predictable way. Stories like that of Pan Am Flight 914 suggest that this certainty might not be as absolute as we believe. Whether the aircraft truly crossed 37 years in an instant, or whether it is a tale shaped and reshaped in the telling, it endures because it whispers of a world where the boundaries we take for granted can dissolve without warning. For those who heard the pilot's voice over the radio that day in Caracas, and for those who have studied the report since, the mystery remains as unresolved now as it was the moment that silver DC-4 lifted off from New York and vanished into the sky. The vanishing DC-4 over the Andes. A blanket of sharp, white light covered the Andes Mountains as the Douglas DC-4 prepared for its flight from Buenos Aires to Santiago in August 1947. The crew, led by Captain Robert L. Lindquist, was experienced in navigating the challenging route across the high peaks, a path that often tested the limits of both pilot skill and machine endurance. On board were 36 people, a mix of passengers and crew, bundled against the lingering winter chill. The weather report showed nothing alarming. Clear skies and favourable winds promised a smooth journey. As the engines roared and the plane lifted from the runway, there was little reason for anyone to imagine that this would be their last recorded moment in the world they knew. Crossing the Pampas and heading toward the mountains, the DC-4 maintained steady communication with air traffic control, its position relayed at regular intervals. Passengers settled into the rhythm of the flight, gazing out at the vast landscapes below, unaware that they were approaching one of the most unforgiving stretches of terrain in South America. The aircraft began its climb toward the passes that would take it through the towering Andean wall, where peaks reached higher than the cruising altitude of many flights. At 3:30 p.m, the pilot reported the expected arrival time in Santiago, still calm, still routine. Then, without warning, radio contact ended. The final message contained no sign of distress, no indication that anything was wrong. It was as if the signal had simply been swallowed by the mountains. The search began within hours, involving Argentine, Chilean and American teams combing both sides of the Andes. Aircraft swept over snowfields and jagged cliffs, their crews scanning for the silver flash of fuselage or the faint trail of smoke that might lead to survivors. On the ground, rescue teams pushed into treacherous passes on foot and horseback, battling altitude sickness and unpredictable weather. Days passed without results. The search was expanded to valleys and glaciers far beyond the flight path, but nothing appeared. No debris, no signals, no bodies. Eventually, with resources stretched and hope fading, The official hunt was called off. The DC-4 had simply disappeared, leaving families with questions that no one could answer. Years rolled into decades, and the Andes held their silence. There were occasional rumours, a shepherd claiming to have seen metal glinting in the sun high on a slope, a mountaineer reporting strange wreckage buried in ice, but nothing that could be confirmed. These scattered stories never matched in detail, and no official expedition was mounted to investigate them fully. The case became one of those mysteries spoken of in hushed tones, a reminder of how quickly the mountains could take and never return. Then, in 1995, nearly 50 years after the disappearance, climbers scaling Mount Tupungato stumbled upon something unexpected. Protruding from a glacier at more than 15,000 feet were pieces of metal that did not belong to the natural landscape. On closer inspection, they found parts of an aircraft engine, fragments of twisted fuselage, and even a few personal items that had been preserved in the ice. News of the find travelled quickly, and within weeks investigators were on site, confirming what many had suspected. The wreckage was from the missing DC-4. It appeared to have flown directly into the mountain, with the force of the impact driving most of the wreckage deep into the glacier. What puzzled many was the condition of some of the items recovered. Fabrics, papers, and even pieces of clothing looked remarkably well preserved, as though they had been locked away in a freezer for decades, which, in a sense, they had. The cold and ice had slowed decay to a crawl, creating an eerie sense that time had barely touched them. For the families of those aboard, the discovery was bittersweet. It offered closure, but it also brought back the reality of a tragedy that had hung unresolved for half a century. The knowledge that their loved ones had been so close, hidden in plain sight beneath the ice, stirred grief all over again. The official explanation was straightforward. The DC-4 had likely flown into poor visibility, perhaps caused by sudden cloud cover or a navigational error. The pilot, believing the plane had already crossed the highest peaks, may have begun a descent too early, leading directly into the mountainside. This was a plausible, practical answer, one that fit the physical evidence. Yet not everyone accepted it entirely. Some pointed to the lack of distress calls, the abrupt end to radio contact, and the absence of debris found during the initial searches as reasons to wonder if there was more to the story. In their view, the Andes had a way of swallowing not just bodies and wreckage, but also the truth. Among the more speculative theories was the idea of a time slip, that the DC-4 and its passengers might have been caught in some kind of atmospheric or geological phenomenon that removed them from their proper place in time. Such an explanation was far outside the bounds of conventional aviation science, yet stories of strange disappearances in the region have long been part of local folklore. These tales speak of travellers stepping into mists and emerging hours or days later in places far from where they began, sometimes with no memory of the missing time. Whether coincidence or something more, the discovery of the DC-4's remains after decades fed into these older legends. The truth of what happened that day in 1947 may never be fully known. The glacier still holds much of the wreckage, locked in layers of ice that may take centuries to release. Pieces continue to emerge slowly, carried by the slow movement of the ice toward lower slopes, where climbers and locals sometimes find them. Each fragment is a reminder of the lives lost and the mystery that kept them hidden for so long. For those who have seen the site, there is a strange stillness in the air, as though the mountains themselves remember the moment of impact and have kept it frozen in their vast, cold memory. In the end, the story of the DC-4 over the Andes is both a tragedy and an enigma. It speaks to the power of nature to preserve and conceal, to take hold of human events and hold them out of reach for generations. It also touches on something deeper, our unease with the idea that time might not move in a straight line for everyone, that there are places in the world where the ordinary rules can shift without warning. Whether the DC-4 was simply claimed by the unforgiving mountains, or whether it brushed against something stranger, the result was the same. A journey interrupted, a story unfinished, and a mystery that still whispers from the high, silent peaks. The RAF Squadron that slipped through time. The summer of 1918 was drawing toward its close when 4 British biplanes lifted off from an airfield in northern France. The war was still raging, but this was not a combat mission. It was a routine training flight, meant to keep the Royal Air Force pilots sharp in formation flying and navigation. The aircraft, all of the same model, rose steadily into the pale morning light, their engines droning in unison as they formed a tight diamond shape in the sky. Below them, the farmland stretched in neat patterns, the ground softened by the haze that often comes before midday heat. Everything about the mission seemed ordinary, a short loop through friendly airspace before returning to base. In the control tower, spotters watched the formation fade into the distance, noting their heading and expected return time. The weather was calm, the air still, and visibility was excellent, conditions any pilot would welcome. Yet as the hours passed, the biplanes did not return. Attempts to contact them by radio were met with silence, and no one on the ground could report having seen them pass overhead. When it became clear the squadron was overdue, the RAF quickly organised a search, sending other planes to retrace the intended route and dispatching ground units to check the fields, forests and small villages along the way. No trace of wreckage was found. It was as though the 4 biplanes had simply been erased from the sky. The investigations that followed explored every plausible explanation. Enemy interception was unlikely, the route had been far from the front lines, and there were no German aircraft reported in the area that day. Mechanical failure seemed improbable, as it would be extraordinary for all 4 planes to suffer simultaneous breakdowns, without at least one managing to make an emergency landing. Weather was ruled out entirely. The skies had been clear, and there was no sudden storm to blame. The conclusion, if it could be called that, was simply that the squadron had vanished without leaving a single clue behind. Years passed, and the war ended, yet the mystery of the missing biplanes remained in the minds of those who had served with the pilots. Then, decades later, reports began to surface that brought the old case back into the light. Multiple accounts emerged from civilians and aviators who claimed to have seen a formation of antique biplanes flying in perfect alignment over various parts of Europe long after such aircraft had been retired. Some of these sightings occurred in the 1930s and 1940s, others even later, with the planes described as immaculate in condition and flying with a precision that suggested skilled hands at the controls. One particular account came from a commercial airline pilot in the 1950s who was crossing the English Channel on a clear day when he spotted 4 vintage biplanes holding tight formation. They flew close enough for him to note their markings, which matched those used by the RAF during the First World War. The strangest part, according to his report, was the way they moved. Not with the subtle bob and sway of older planes fighting the wind, but with an almost gliding steadiness, as if unaffected by the air currents around them. Before he could establish radio contact, the formation banked sharply into a low cloud bank and never emerged. Stories like this might have been dismissed as mistaken identity or nostalgia colouring a memory, but they were remarkably consistent across witnesses who had no connection to one another. The descriptions matched not only in the number of aircraft and their markings, but also in the eerie quietness of their flight and the sudden complete disappearance into clouds or mist. For some, these reports were evidence that the squadron had somehow slipped through time on that summer day in 1918, caught in a loop that returned them to the skies again and again in different decades, never quite touching the ground in the present. Skeptics have pointed out that aviation folklore is full of stories of phantom aircraft, often fueled by the romantic image of pilots lost in war. They suggest that the sightings could be misinterpretations of airshows, where vintage planes sometimes take to the skies in formation, or even flights of modern planes designed to resemble older models. Yet the lack of sound in many of the accounts, along with the sudden vanishing acts, continues to trouble those who try to explain the mystery in purely ordinary terms. The notion that a squadron might have somehow stepped outside its own time can't be confirmed, yet it persists, largely because it echoes a wider pattern of mysterious events in aviation history. Pilots throughout history have described strange walls of cloud that appear without warning, moments of complete disorientation where instruments spin wildly and horizons seem to tilt in impossible ways. In rare cases, those who emerge from such events find themselves off course not by miles but by hours, sometimes even days, with no clear memory of how the time was lost. What happened to the 4 RAF biplanes might be the most extreme version of this, not just a delay but a complete removal from the timeline we know. For the families of the missing pilots, the absence of wreckage or confirmation left the grief suspended, never fully closing. Photographs of young men in leather helmets and goggles, grinning beside their aircraft, remained on mantels and in drawers, aging while the subjects in them stayed forever in their early 20s. In some retellings, the idea that the squadron still flies somewhere in some other moment is almost a comfort, a way to imagine that they are not gone but simply out of reach. Whatever the truth, the story has taken on a life beyond its original loss. Each new account of 4 vintage biplanes gliding silently through the sky revives the questions asked in that summer of 1918. Were the pilots victims of a rare and deadly navigational mistake, their remains hidden somewhere beyond discovery? Or did they find themselves pulled into a place where the years pass differently, a place that occasionally brushes against our own sky before vanishing again? The answers may be locked away in a moment that has not yet finished unfolding, and until then, the image of the 4 planes in perfect formation continues to drift through time as steady and unreachable as the clouds themselves. The Bold Street shopping glitch. The city of Liverpool was alive with the hum of late morning traffic when Frank, a retired police officer, decided to head into the centre to meet his wife for some shopping. Bold Street, with its mix of modern stores and older buildings, had long been one of the busiest and most colourful stretches in the city. He knew it well, having walked its length countless times during his years on the force, and that day the air was filled with the sound of buskers playing on the corner and shop doors swinging open and shut as customers came and went. There was nothing unusual in the sky or on the street to suggest that he was about to experience something he would never be able to explain. As Frank crossed the road near the Lyceum building, his thoughts were focused on little more than getting to the bookstore ahead. The pavement under his feet felt solid, the same as always, but something about the atmosphere around him shifted in a way he could not immediately place. The air seemed quieter, yet heavier, as if the normal buzz of the street had been muffled. Without realising it, he'd slowed his pace, his eyes catching on details that seemed wrong. The bright glass windows of the shops had changed, replaced by large, old-fashioned displays of goods arranged with meticulous care. Cars that had been parked along the curb moments earlier were gone, and in their place stood vehicles with rounded edges and chrome trim, the kind he had not seen outside of car shows for decades. People were walking along the pavement in clothing that looked like it belonged in an old photograph. Women in calf-length dresses and gloves, men in suits and hats, even in the mild summer weather. Frank's instinct was to scan for familiar faces, a habit from his years in uniform, but none of the people around him seemed to notice him at all. Conversations drifted by, but the accents were sharper, the phrases older, as though they belonged to a different era. Every sign he passed had lettering and designs he'd only ever seen in history books or archival photos. The bookstore he had been aiming for was nowhere to be seen. In its place stood a shop selling women's handbags and shoes, its wooden door propped open to the street. Trying to keep his composure, Frank stepped inside, expecting perhaps to find an explanation in the form of a themed display or special event. Instead, he was met with the smell of leather and polish, and behind the counter stood a woman whose hairstyle and makeup matched the fashions of the mid-20th century. She greeted him with a polite but somewhat puzzled expression, as if his appearance was not quite in step with the world she was used to. The moment felt surreal. There was no sense of waking from a dream or realizing he had been mistaken. Everything was too vivid, too solid under his hand as he touched the edge of the counter. A sudden movement outside caught his attention, and he turned to see the street again. This time, the vehicles looked modern, the shop fronts familiar, and the sounds of present-day Liverpool had returned as if someone had flicked a switch. The handbag store was gone, replaced once more by the bookstore he had been looking for. Frank stepped out, glancing back in disbelief, half expecting the door to change again before his eyes. People around him moved normally, their clothing and conversations back to the style he knew. For a moment he stood rooted to the spot, trying to decide whether to tell anyone what had just happened. In the weeks that followed, Frank recounted his experience to a few friends and former colleagues, expecting skepticism. To his surprise, several people told him they had heard of similar incidents on Bold Street. Shoppers and pedestrians had described moments where the world around them seemed to shift into another time, sometimes just for a few seconds, sometimes long enough to explore a street that no longer existed. Accounts varied in the era experienced, with some describing the 1950s and others the late Victorian period, but the common thread was the suddenness and the complete sensory immersion in a time not their own. Local historians noted that Bold Street had been a hub of commerce for more than a century, and its physical layout had changed only gradually over the decades. Some wondered whether the layering of so many eras in the same physical space could somehow allow people to slip into an earlier version of the street, as though the past and present occasionally brushed together. Those more inclined toward the paranormal spoke of time slips, moments when the boundaries between different periods grow thin, allowing a person to cross briefly into another moment entirely. Doubters pointed to the limits of human perception as a more likely explanation. They suggested that the brain, under certain conditions, might misinterpret sensory information, creating the illusion of being in another time. In such a bustling place as Bold Street, with its blend of old and new architecture, it might be possible for someone to momentarily lose their sense of where they were, especially if distracted or preoccupied. Yet even these more cautious voices admitted that the level of detail in some accounts, down to the specific brands on display in vanished shops, was difficult to explain away entirely. Frank's own certainty never wavered. He had no interest in sensationalizing what had happened, but he knew without doubt that he had walked, however briefly, into a version of Bold Street that belonged to another era. He could still recall the weight of the handbag he had picked up in the shop, the texture of the leather under his fingers, and the way the shopkeeper's eyes lingered on him as though she recognized he was out of place. That memory remained as vivid years later as it had on the day it happened. The Bold Street shopping glitch, as it came to be called among those who shared such experiences, has since drawn the attention of researchers, journalists, and the curious. Some visit the street hoping for their own glimpse into the past, while others treat it as a charming piece of local folklore. Whether a trick of the mind, a rare phenomenon of physics, or something that defies both explanations, it endures because it offers a tantalizing suggestion that time might not be as fixed as we believe, and that the past may be closer than we think, just waiting for the moment when we unknowingly step into it. The mystery of Flight 19's final radio call. It began as a routine training mission, the kind that naval aviators had completed countless times before without incident. On December 5th, 1945, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers known as Flight 19 departed from the US Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on a navigation exercise that was supposed to take them over the Atlantic and back in a precise triangular route. The pilots were all experienced men, though some of the crew members were new to the area, and the weather forecast had promised good visibility with only scattered clouds. For the first part of the flight, everything seemed normal. Then, without warning, the calm routine began to unravel in ways that no one on the ground could have predicted. Communications from the aircraft came in fragmented bursts, carrying the voice of the flight leader, Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, who sounded increasingly unsure of their position. In the radio room back at the base, operators leaned in close to their equipment, straining to make sense of his words through the static. Taylor reported that his compasses were malfunctioning and that he couldn't determine the direction of the Florida coastline. He believed they were over the Florida Keys when, in reality, they were hundreds of miles northeast, drifting further into the Atlantic. Each attempt by the control tower to guide them home was met with confusion. Despite repeated instructions, Taylor seemed unable to orient himself, and the rest of the formation followed his lead into what became a slow, spiraling disappearance. The minutes turned to hours as the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the churning ocean below. Back at the base, more skilled operators were called in to take over the radio exchanges, hoping fresh voices might calm the situation. They urged Taylor to turn west, toward the setting sun, but his transmissions hinted at an unsettling reality. He could no longer tell which way was west. At times, the static would clear just enough to hear him say they were lost in white water, or that the ocean looked strange. Some reports from those who listened live recalled his voice carrying a sharp edge of fear, even though he was a veteran pilot. The words weren't just about navigation errors anymore. They hinted at something more, something disorienting and unfamiliar. A rescue operation was launched even before the last message was received, with planes and ships prepared to search in every possible direction. As darkness settled, radio contact became even more sporadic. Taylor's final transmission, as recorded in official summaries, was chilling in its brevity. "We don't know where we are," he reportedly said, followed by a fragment, Everything looks wrong, strange. Moments later, silence replaced the voices that had been struggling against the static all day. The 5 bombers, carrying 14 men in total, had vanished into the night without leaving a trace. Not a single piece of wreckage or body was ever recovered, despite one of the largest search efforts in naval history at the time. Adding to the mystery was the fate of one of the rescue planes sent to find them. A massive PBM Mariner flying boat, carrying 13 crew members, took off from Naval Air Station Banana River and headed toward the last known coordinates. Less than an hour later, it too vanished from radar. Witnesses aboard ships in the area reported seeing a distant flash of fire on the water, possibly an explosion, but no wreckage was recovered from this incident either. This double disappearance, 5 planes on a routine mission and a search plane sent after them, turned a troubling event into a legendary one, fueling speculation that went far beyond navigational errors. Over the decades, theories multiplied, each attempting to explain why so many trained men could lose their bearings in clear weather and why no trace of them could be found. Some believed a combination of compass malfunctions and poor visibility led them far off course, where fuel eventually ran out, and they plunged into the sea in a remote location. Others pointed to the notorious reputation of the Bermuda Triangle, claiming that sudden storms, magnetic anomalies, or even something more otherworldly could have played a role. Witnesses and amateur researchers sometimes referred to the strange phrases in Taylor's transmissions as proof that the crew encountered a phenomenon they couldn't comprehend. The official stance favoured human mistakes and mechanical faults, yet fragments of the evidence resisted that conclusion. Taylor was an experienced pilot who had flown over the same region before, and his inability to recognise familiar landmarks or determine west using the position of the sun puzzled experts. The fact that the other pilots in the formation didn't break away and try to navigate back independently suggested they trusted Taylor's judgment until the very end, even as that judgment seemed clouded by uncertainty. The US Navy eventually declared the incident the result of causes or reasons unknown, a vague conclusion that only deepened public fascination. Accounts from people who claimed to have listened to the transmissions as they occurred deepened the sense of unease. Some insisted that before the final silence, there were faint background noises on the radio that didn't sound like engine static or normal interference, tones and patterns that seemed unnatural. These accounts were never confirmed in official records, but they became a permanent part of the legend. For families of the missing, the lack of physical evidence meant they could never be entirely sure of what happened. The Atlantic had swallowed their loved ones whole, leaving them with questions that would never be answered. In the years that followed, Flight 19 became one of the cornerstone mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle, cited in books, documentaries, and whispered conversations about strange events at sea. Pilots and sailors alike admitted to feeling uneasy when passing through the same waters, not because of what they knew, but because of what no one could explain. Each retelling of the story carried the echo of those last words, faint and distorted through the static, an experienced leader lost in a place he could no longer recognize, speaking into the void as darkness closed in around them. The Versailles time-slip encounter. It was a warm afternoon in 1901 when 2 English women, Charlotte Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, decided to take a stroll through the gardens of the Palace of Versailles. They were academics on holiday in France, enjoying the grandeur of the historic estate. But as they wandered away from the main paths, an odd stillness seemed to settle over the air. The sunlight dulled as if a thin veil had been drawn across the sky, and the hum of other visitors faded until it felt as though the gardens had emptied completely. Both women felt an inexplicable heaviness in the atmosphere, as if they had stepped into a place where time itself moved differently. Their walk took them toward a small lane flanked by tall trees, and along this path they saw 2 men dressed in green coats with tricorn hats, their faces pale and expressionless. The clothing was ornate and centuries out of date, yet the men didn't look like actors or costumed guides. Something about the scene felt disturbingly real, yet completely out of place. When Moberly and Jourdain asked for directions to the Petit Trianon, the men pointed without speaking much, their voices low and oddly flat. The exchange left both women with an uneasy feeling, as though they had brushed against something not entirely belonging to the present. A short distance later, they spotted a woman sitting beneath a shaded structure, sketching in a notebook. She wore a pale summer dress with a wide-brimmed hat, her features sharp and distinctly aristocratic. The way she held herself, and the complete lack of acknowledgement when they passed, struck them as unusual. Moberly would later claim that she believed this woman to be none other than Queen Marie Antoinette herself, dressed as she might have been before the French Revolution. Yet neither woman could explain why such a figure would be calmly sketching in the garden, completely unbothered by their presence, more than a century after her execution. The route they took became increasingly strange. Buildings that they later could not find on any map seemed to appear along the way, including a small stone bridge and a row of cottages that looked freshly maintained, as if still lived in. The air remained unnervingly still, without the sound of leaves rustling or birds calling, and the light seemed to hover in an unnatural yellowed glow. Jourdain described the sensation as walking inside a painted scene, vivid yet somehow two-dimensional. It was only after passing a group of gardeners in similarly outdated attire that the women began to feel an urgent need to return to familiar ground. When they finally reached the Petit Trianon, the strange atmosphere abruptly lifted. The warm chatter of tourists returned, the sunlight brightened, and the people they saw now wore the clothing of the early 20th century. The transition was so sudden that the two women stood still for several moments, trying to understand what had just happened. There had been no obvious boundary they crossed, no sound or sight to mark the shift, only a jarring return to normality, as though they had stepped through an invisible doorway back into their own time. Only after a few days had passed did they begin to compare their recollections in depth. Both recalled the same figures, the same unnatural light, and the same structures that they later discovered should not have existed in that part of the grounds. They read historical records and found references to buildings that had once stood there in the 18th century, but were demolished long before 1901. The precision of the similarities between their recollections left them unsettled, since neither believed the other could have invented such details without prior knowledge. In 1911, they published their experience in a book titled An Adventure, using pseudonyms to avoid ridicule. They described the event as a time slip, in which they had somehow walked into the late 1700s, perhaps to a day just before the French Revolution's chaos reached Versailles. The publication caused a stir, with some readers fascinated by the possibility of time travel, while others dismissed the story as a fanciful invention or the result of shared hallucination. Critics argued that they may have stumbled upon a historical reenactment without realizing it, but the women insisted there had been no signs, no performances, and no other tourists who seemed aware of the strange costumed figures. Many different theories have found their way into the discussion over the years. Some researchers suggested psychological phenomena, claiming that Moberly and Jourdain may have entered a dissociative state triggered by the quiet and heat of the afternoon. Others speculated about environmental factors, perhaps a rare meteorological condition that altered their perception of light and sound, creating an illusion of stepping into another era. There were even theories involving the paranormal, with suggestions that they had walked into an echo of the past, a kind of residual haunting that replayed a moment in time for those sensitive enough to perceive it. As the decades passed, the story refused to fade into obscurity. Those who visited Versailles after reading An Adventure sometimes claimed to feel an unusual stillness in certain areas, as if the air held a memory waiting to be noticed. Skeptics countered that such impressions were born from suggestion, yet the detail and conviction in Moberly and Jourdain's account made it difficult to dismiss entirely. Even historians, though doubtful, admitted that the architectural features the women described matched historical records that were not widely available to the public at the time. By the end of their lives, both women maintained their belief that they had truly experienced a slip through time. They never altered their descriptions, never admitted to fabrication, and seemed unconcerned with whether the world chose to believe them. To them, the gardens of Versailles had briefly opened a window into the past, one that closed as silently as it had appeared. Long after their deaths, the Versailles time slip remains a story that refuses to be neatly explained. Whether it was an extraordinary coincidence, a psychological episode, or something far stranger, it stands as a reminder that even the most familiar places can conceal layers of history, not bound by the ordinary rules of time. The thought lingers for visitors walking those same shaded paths, that perhaps, with the right combination of place, light and chance, The past might not be as distant as we think. The lightning storm that stopped time. Rain hammered against the windows of a small farmhouse on the edge of a quiet rural town, while thunder rolled endlessly in the distance. The air outside felt heavy, almost pressing down on the fields, and the flashes of lightning came so frequently that they painted the landscape in bursts of blinding white. Inside, a man named Daniel sat by the kitchen table, listening to the rising pitch of the wind as it whipped through the trees. He'd seen storms in this part of the country before, but there was something about this one that made him feel uneasy, like it was building towards something more than just rain and wind. When the first power surge hit, the lights flickered, and a low humming seemed to seep in from the walls, vibrating through the floor and into his chair. Daniel stood, moving toward the back door, drawn by the unnatural glow spreading across the fields. Lightning forked across the sky, but instead of fading in an instant, the bright streaks seemed to freeze in place, suspended like glowing cracks in a pane of glass. The wind died without warning, leaving an eerie stillness behind, and the constant patter of rain abruptly stopped, as if someone had silenced the world with the push of a button. Stepping outside, he noticed that the storm seemed locked in a single moment, as if every droplet of rain had been captured in mid-air. The trees no longer swayed, their leaves frozen mid-twist, and the thunder's low rumble hung in the air without fading. Daniel's breath came out in slow, heavy clouds, though the air didn't feel cold, and his heartbeat sounded louder than it should have in the oppressive quiet. He reached toward one of the hovering raindrops only to watch his finger pass straight through it, leaving no ripple, no movement, nothing. Moving further into the open field, he saw the outline of a lightning bolt still suspended between the clouds and the earth, its branching form frozen in the exact instant of its strike. The light didn't fade or dim, it glowed steadily, casting long, unmoving shadows across the ground. Daniel couldn't help but feel as if he was walking through a photograph, every detail sharp, every angle too precise. His own footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound had nowhere to go in this unmoving world. A strange distortion hung in the air just beyond the lightning's frozen tip, almost like a shimmer of heat on asphalt. Daniel approached it slowly, unsure why it seemed to pull at his thoughts, drawing him closer with each step. When he reached out, the shimmer pulsed once, and the world around him seemed to ripple. He pulled his hand back, but the air didn't feel like air anymore. It felt thick, almost like water, yet he could breathe without effort. A low vibration hummed in his bones, and for a brief second his vision blurred in a way that made it hard to tell whether he was still in the field at all. In the distance, movement broke the stillness. A figure stood near the tree line, though Daniel couldn't make out any features. It didn't walk toward him or away, it just stood there, perfectly still, as if watching. He called out, his voice carrying farther than it should have, stretching unnaturally before fading. The figure didn't answer. It wasn't until he blinked that he realized the figure had shifted closer, without taking a single step. Its sudden change in position made his chest tighten, and he felt a strange cold creep through his arms, despite the still warm air. The sky above remained frozen in its turbulent state, with dark clouds split open by the same glowing branches of lightning. Daniel tried to back away from the shimmer in the air, but every step seemed to take more effort than it should, as if the ground was subtly pulling him forward. He glanced again toward the figure by the trees, only to find it gone. His heartbeat was loud in his ears, and a feeling of being observed settled so heavily on him that he had to keep turning his head, searching for what might be there. A sudden shift broke the perfect stillness. A single drop of rain fell past his face, landing soundlessly at his feet. The frozen lightning flickered once, just enough to make the shadows waver, and Daniel knew that whatever moment he'd stepped into was starting to break apart. More raindrops began to fall in slow motion, almost lazily at first, before gaining speed. The trees trembled as the wind returned in a rush, and the distant roll of thunder began to move again, as though it had been released from some invisible grip. The shimmer in the air collapsed inward with a faint pop, like the sound of a bubble bursting, and the strange thickness he had felt was gone in an instant. The lightning bolt struck the ground with a deafening crack, so loud it rattled his teeth, and the rain came down in a pounding sheet that soaked him through in seconds. The storm's full force had returned, but Daniel barely noticed as he stumbled back toward the farmhouse, glancing repeatedly toward the trees where the figure had once been. Later that night, the power came back on, and the storm moved east, leaving only a few downed branches and flooded ditches behind. Daniel tried to convince himself that he had imagined it all, that the pressure of the storm, the lightning, and the strange atmosphere had played tricks on his senses. But the image of the frozen sky, the hanging raindrops, and that still figure in the distance refused to fade from his mind. Even days later, he found himself looking toward the fields whenever the wind grew still, wondering if another storm might bring the same impossible silence again. Some in town dismissed his account as the result of fear and imagination, yet a few older residents quietly told him they had heard stories like his before. They spoke of storms that seemed to catch the world in one unbroken moment, and of people who had stepped into something that wasn't meant for them. None of those stories had explanations, and none of the tellers had answers. Daniel didn't need them. He'd seen enough to know that if the world could stop once, it could stop again. And if it did, he wasn't sure he wanted to be anywhere near the lightning when it happened. The Ghost Train of Cape Town. Late at night, when the streets of Cape Town have fallen quiet and the distant hum of the city fades into the stillness, there are whispers of a sound that doesn't belong to this time. Locals who have lived near the railway lines for decades tell stories of a deep, echoing rumble cutting through that darkness, followed by the piercing wail of an old steam whistle that no modern train could produce. It is said that if you stand by certain deserted stretches of track in the cold hours before dawn, you might feel the ground tremble ever so slightly beneath your feet, as if something massive were approaching, only to see nothing but empty rails stretching into the night. Those who claim to have experienced it firsthand often describe the events with a shiver, as though the memory itself carries a weight. A man named Peter van der Merwe once recounted walking home from a late shift in the winter of 1983 when he heard the unmistakable rhythm of iron wheels against steel rails. He knew the schedule of the trains well, and there was nothing due at that hour, yet the sound grew louder, accompanied by the thick smell of burning coal. As he turned toward the tracks, a dense mist rolled in from nowhere, curling around the street lamps and obscuring everything more than a few meters away. The whistle sounded again, sharp and mournful, and then, as suddenly as it began, the noise ceased. The mist cleared, and the rails before him were silent and still. Not every encounter with the so-called ghost train is so fleeting. In the late 1990s, a pair of university students who had been researching local legends decided to test the stories for themselves. They chose a stretch of track near the old Salt River station, which had been in use since the late 1800s, and was known for its share of railway accidents. Setting up with cameras and recording equipment, they waited for hours in the damp, cold night, hearing nothing but the occasional creak of metal as the rail settled. Then, a little after 2 a.m., their audio picked up a faint chugging sound, growing louder over several minutes. The students swore that through the fog they could make out the dark outline of a locomotive, its shape faint and shimmering like a reflection on water. It moved past them slowly, the glow of its front lamp diffused by the mist, and yet their cameras showed only empty air. The legend's roots seemed to stretch back nearly a century, with one of the earliest accounts dating to the 1920s. At that time, steam locomotives dominated South Africa's railways, and the Cape Town network was expanding rapidly. In 1923, a train carrying passengers from Johannesburg to Cape Town derailed near a bend just outside the city, plunging several cars down a rocky embankment. Dozens were injured and at least 12 passengers died. Newspaper reports of the time made no mention of ghosts, but locals later began connecting the tragedy to unexplained sightings along that same stretch of track. According to oral tradition, the ghost train is said to retrace that final route, its phantom whistle echoing through the night as though still trying to complete a journey it never finished. Many of the reported encounters share similar details: an unnatural cold in the air, a fog that appears without warning, and the smell of coal smoke despite the absence of any working steam trains for decades. Witnesses often speak of hearing muffled voices or the clang of metal couplings, and some claim to have glimpsed figures in the windows staring out with vacant expressions. A railway maintenance worker in 2004 described stopping in his tracks when he thought he saw a uniformed conductor step down from a passing train, only for the figure to fade into the mist before his eyes. His co-workers laughed at the story, yet he refused to walk that section of rail alone again. Critics dismiss the accounts as a blend of vivid imagination and environmental factors. Cape Town's coastal climate often produces dense fog, and the sound of modern freight trains travelling on distant tracks can carry unusually far under the right conditions. Low-frequency vibrations might also travel through the rails, creating the illusion of an approaching engine. Historians note that stories of phantom trains exist in many countries, often tied to tragic accidents, and suggest that these tales may serve as a way for communities to keep local history alive through folklore. Still, some details resist easy explanation. Some of the most compelling testimonies come from visitors who had no prior knowledge of the legend. In 2012, a British tourist named Amelia Clark was staying in a guest house near the rail line when she was awakened by the sound of a train whistle in the early hours. Curious, she stepped outside and saw a large, dark locomotive roll by without a single light in its cars. She assumed it was an antique train run for tourism, but when she mentioned it to the guest house owner the next morning, she was told there had been no train scheduled at that time for years, and certainly not a steam engine. Her account matched the descriptions of countless others, right down to the strange stillness that followed. The mystery deepens with the occasional reports of physical traces left behind. On rare occasions, railway workers have found damp patches on the rails in the exact pattern left by freshly passed wheels, despite no train having been scheduled. Others have reported faint soot marks along the ballast stones beside the track, as though from an old coal-fired locomotive. These traces vanish within hours, and there is never any mechanical evidence to confirm that a train passed through. There is also an older layer to the ghost train story that ties it to the land's more distant past. Before the railway was built, the area was the site of several colonial-era skirmishes, and some believe the energy of those violent events has lingered, becoming intertwined with later tragedies. Spiritualists claim the ghost train is not just a residual echo of a single accident, but a moving collection of restless spirits drawn together along the steel rails, replaying fragments of their last moments in an endless loop. For those who live in Cape Town, the ghost train has become part of the city's identity, an eerie thread in the weave of its history. Some avoid the tracks entirely at night, while others go out searching for a glimpse of the phantom locomotive. Whether born from tragedy, imagination, or something beyond human understanding, the legend refuses to fade. The city continues to expand, and modern trains still run on some of the same routes, but the ghostly echoes of a bygone era seem to cling stubbornly to the rails. And so, on certain cold nights when the mist drapes itself over the city like a curtain, you might hear that lonely whistle and feel the vibration of wheels on steel, even though nothing is there at all. The village that disappeared overnight. In the remote northern reaches of Canada, where winter's grip can linger for months and the wind carries with it the scent of untouched pine forests, there once stood a small settlement known as Anjukuni. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where the few cabins that lined the frozen lake stood like sentinels against the cold, and where visitors were so rare that their arrival would be remembered for years. Yet one day in the early 1930s, a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle came upon the village to find an unsettling silence, the kind that doesn't just signal absence, but feels almost unnatural, as if something had deliberately swept life away. The snow lay undisturbed around the homes, and the front doors stood open, groaning quietly in the wind, inviting him to see what had been left behind. What struck LaBelle first was how everything seemed frozen in time, as though the people had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. Pots of stew still hung over cold stoves, half-eaten meals sat on tables, and clothing lay draped over chairs, waiting for an owner who would never put them on again. The dogs, normally tethered to posts outside, were nowhere to be found, though some reports would later say they were discovered dead, starved despite being close to food supplies. The absence of footprints, sled tracks, or any other sign of movement was perhaps the most chilling detail. Snow had fallen since their disappearance, but there should have been some evidence that a mass departure had taken place. Instead, the village stood as if sealed away from the world, its story locked inside the stillness. Searching from cabin to cabin, LaBelle found no signs of struggle, no broken doors, no overturned furniture. It was as though the people had calmly stopped whatever they were doing, set their belongings down, and walked into the white wilderness without any apparent reason. In one dwelling, a rifle rested by the door with a full magazine, something that no hunter or trapper would willingly leave behind in such a remote region. The food stores were untouched, and valuables lay where they had always been. If there had been a threat, it had left no trace of itself behind. The deeper Lebel looked, the more the silence began to press in on him, almost as though the village itself had absorbed the voices and footsteps of those who once lived there. When he finally left to alert the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the journey back felt heavier than when he'd first come. Each step through the snow seemed to echo the unanswered questions gathering in his mind. Upon arriving at the nearest telegraph station, he relayed the strange discovery, and a detachment of Mounties was dispatched to investigate. Their search confirmed every detail Lebel had given them, but they were equally unable to determine where the villagers had gone or why they had left so suddenly. In some accounts, the Mounties found the graves in the small burial ground disturbed, as if something or someone had dug them open. The official records on this point are unclear, leaving later retellings to debate whether this was true or the embellishment of storytellers. If an official explanation existed, it was never undoubtedly shared with the public. Some suggested that the villagers had been forced to leave due to some environmental danger, such as a sudden ice shift on the lake or poisoned water, though no such evidence was found. Others speculated about attacks by rival groups or even wild animals, but the complete lack of tracks seemed to rule these out. Over the years, the theories grew stranger, drifting into the realm of the supernatural. Stories emerged of strange lights in the sky on the night of the disappearance, told by trappers from nearby regions who claimed to have seen them dancing over the horizon like silent fires. These tales, impossible to confirm, added another layer of mystery that has never been stripped away. Generations later, the story of the vanished village would be passed down in the region's oral traditions, often told around fires in winter cabins as the wind howled outside. For some, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of the wilderness, a reminder that in such a vast and unforgiving place, people could vanish without leaving even a footprint behind. For others, it was a story that spoke of forces beyond human understanding, forces that could reach into the heart of a community and remove it in an instant. The fact that the number of missing was never firmly established, some accounts say a few dozen, others far more, only deepened the uncertainty surrounding what had happened. Over time, researchers and journalists would attempt to retrace Lebel's route, piecing together the scraps of evidence that remained. Many came away convinced that at least some details had been exaggerated in the retelling, pointing out that contemporary records of the event were scarce and inconsistent. Yet even those who doubted the wilder claims admitted that something unusual had happened there, something that the official reports either failed to capture or chose not to share. Whether through negligence, embarrassment, or a genuine inability to explain it, the disappearance slipped into that shadowy space where fact and folklore blur together. Travellers passing through the region say the old settlement carries a lingering sense of unease. Nature has long since reclaimed the cabins, collapsing roofs and erasing paths, until only faint traces remain to show where the community once stood. Visitors often remark that the air feels different there, heavier somehow, as though the absence of human life has left a permanent mark on the place. Standing among the ruins, it's hard not to imagine the moment before the disappearance, when the lake was frozen under a moonlit sky and the chimneys gave off thin streams of smoke, never knowing that these would be their last. Even now, when satellites can map every curve of the Earth's surface and aircraft can reach the most remote corners in hours, the mystery of the vanished village refuses to yield its answers. Every retelling invites more questions. Why was there no sign of departure? What could make an entire community leave behind food, weapons, and shelter in the dead of winter? And if they had gone willingly, where could they possibly have gone? Without evidence, the story remains suspended in the cold air of the north, a frozen puzzle whose missing pieces may never be found. A place alive with activity, then silent and hollow. It's a contrast that clings to memory. It's not just the absence of the people that haunts the imagination, but the way their world was left behind. Unfinished meals, half-sewn garments, tools laid out as if work was to resume at any moment. In that stillness, the boundary between the ordinary and the impossible seems to dissolve, leaving behind a silence that is louder than any sound. Whatever happened in Anjukuni left no survivors to tell the tale, only a story carried forward by those who stumbled upon the emptiness and could never quite shake its hold. The Lost Patrol of World War I. Fog clung low over the muddy trenches as dawn broke, the pale light barely cutting through the thick mist that rolled across the devastated landscape. Somewhere beyond the wire, a small group of soldiers from the British Army prepared to carry out what should have been a routine reconnaissance. It was December 1915, in the bitter chill of the First World War's Western Front, and these men, young, weary and hardened by months of fighting, were part of a patrol assigned to check enemy positions before an expected offensive. They set off quietly, boots sinking into the frozen mud, their figures swallowed by the grey haze, and for those left behind in the trenches, it was the last time anyone would see them alive. What happened after that moment has never been clearly understood, though many have tried to piece together the fragments of truth. The patrol was made up of around a dozen men, led by a sergeant known for his caution and discipline. They were experienced enough to move without noise, weaving through shell craters and debris, past shattered tree stumps and collapsed dugouts. Hours later, when they failed to return, their absence was first dismissed as a delay. Perhaps they had been forced to hide in a shell hole or take a longer route back. But as the day stretched on and night fell again, concern hardened into alarm. Messages were sent up the chain of command, and soon a search party was sent to retrace their steps. The searchers expected to find signs of a skirmish, spent cartridges, bloodstains, or even enemy bodies, but the ground told them nothing. No footprints were leading away into the distance, no dropped equipment that might suggest panic or struggle. The patrol's path simply ended. The only clue, if it could be called that, was a section of ground that seemed oddly disturbed, as though the mud had been churned by movement, yet no clear pattern emerged to explain it. The absence of evidence was so complete that the search party began to wonder if they had somehow taken a path invisible to those who came after. In the weeks that followed, rumours began to circulate among the men in the trenches. Some claimed the patrol had been caught in a sudden and overwhelming artillery barrage, obliterated so completely that nothing was left to recover. Others whispered about the possibility of enemy tunnels, long, narrow passages dug beneath the battlefield, into which the men might have stumbled, either taken prisoner or buried alive when the walls collapsed. The strangest version of the story, however, came from a soldier who swore he saw a thick, low-hanging cloud envelop the patrol that morning, a strange yellowish mist that seemed to swallow them whole before drifting away. The commanding officers dismissed such tales as the product of nerves and exhaustion, but privately they too were troubled. Patrols went missing from time to time during the war, but usually there was at least some indication of what had happened: a body, a piece of equipment, or the sound of fighting. This disappearance, though, left only questions. There was no sign that the enemy had even been aware of the patrol's presence, no intercepted communication boasting of captured prisoners, and no reports from nearby units that they had seen the men after they left their own trench. Winter deepened, and the war moved on, but the incident was never officially closed. Decades later, historians combing through regimental records found brief mentions of the lost patrol, but nothing that brought the truth any closer. Some believed the men had wandered into an uncharted section of the battlefield, where unexploded shells and shifting ground created deadly traps, swallowing them in an instant. Others suggested that they had been caught in a mine explosion from beneath, their bodies entombed deep below the surface. In both cases, the silence that followed would have been absolute, leaving their comrades unaware of the disaster until it was far too late. There is also the possibility that the patrol, faced with overwhelming danger, made a desperate choice to desert. Such cases, while rare, did occur during the war, and the chaos of the front could allow a small group to slip away. Yet if that had been the case, they left no trace of where they went, and no report of captured deserters matching their description was ever recorded. It seemed unlikely that they could have crossed miles of enemy-held territory without being seen, and even less likely that they could have survived the freezing winter without supplies or shelter. First-hand accounts from surviving members of the regiment suggest that the disappearance haunted the men for years afterward. Some claim to dream of the lost patrol, seeing them in their minds as they had been that morning, faces pale in the dawn light, boots heavy with mud, rifles slung over their shoulders as they vanished into the mist. The idea that they had met a violent end was grim enough, but the thought that they might have suffered alone and unseen was far worse. In more recent years, battlefield archaeologists have searched the area where the patrol was last seen using ground-penetrating radar and other modern tools. They found collapsed tunnels, long-forgotten trenches and buried munitions, but no definitive evidence of the missing men. The lack of discovery only deepens the mystery, as if the ground itself is guarding their fate. Some researchers point out that the Western Front was constantly shifting, with bombardments altering the landscape beyond recognition, so any trace could have been erased within days. When the war ended, the families of the missing soldiers were left without answers. Officially, their names were listed among the many thousands missing in action, their graves unknown. Memorials were built in stone, their names carved alongside others who vanished into the chaos of the Great War. But for those who knew them personally, the unanswered question remained. What truly happened on that cold December morning, when 12 men stepped into the mist and never came back? Even after so much time has passed, the vanishing of the patrol lingers in the minds of military scholars and mystery seekers alike. It is a reminder that even in an age of meticulous record-keeping and eyewitness reports, some stories slip through the cracks, leaving behind only fragments of rumour and speculation. Perhaps the truth lies buried under layers of earth, waiting to be uncovered, or perhaps it has already been lost forever, carried away with the lives of the men who knew it. And so, the lost patrol remains where it has always been, just out of reach, half hidden in the fog of war. The Black Sea Yacht Incident. Waves moved gently across the surface of the Black Sea, carrying with them the faint scent of salt and a distant promise of summer warmth, as a sleek white yacht named Belaya Zvezda drifted toward the horizon. It was a vessel built for comfort more than speed, the kind that wealthy owners used for leisurely cruises along the coast between Sochi and Batumi. That morning in late August 2008, the passengers aboard were in high spirits, enjoying calm waters and clear skies after setting out from the Georgian port of Poti. No one could have guessed that within hours, the yacht's journey would end in one of the region's most perplexing maritime disappearances. Not long after midday, a faint haze began to build over the water, creeping toward the yacht from the east as if drawn by an unseen hand. Crew members reportedly discussed altering course to avoid the growing fog, but radio transmissions to the Port Authority made no mention of distress or concern. Witnesses on the coast would later claim they saw the yacht vanish into the mist without slowing or turning, swallowed by a pale wall that seemed out of place in such warm weather. The Belaya Zvezda did not send another transmission after that, and its radar signature disappeared moments later. Local authorities were quick to organise a search, aware that the Black Sea's unpredictable currents could scatter debris far and wide. Naval patrols scoured the area for 2 days, tracing the yacht's last known coordinates and running sonar scans in case it had capsized. Yet no wreckage, no life rafts, and no bodies were found. It was as though the vessel had been erased from the sea entirely. Nearby fishermen, interviewed during the search, spoke of an eerie stillness in the air that day and an unnatural quiet on the water, as though something had silenced the sea itself. Speculation quickly spread among both investigators and the public, fueled by the timing of the event. The disappearance occurred just weeks after the 2008 Russo-Georgian War, when tensions in the region were still raw and military activity on the water was unusually high. Some believe the yacht may have strayed into a restricted area and been intercepted, its passengers detained, and its fate concealed for political reasons. Yet this theory clashed with the lack of radar or satellite evidence of any approaching vessels, and no government ever admitted to involvement. One of the more unsettling leads came from a merchant ship that reported seeing a faint glowing light low over the water near the time of the disappearance. The crew, speaking on condition of anonymity, described it as a pale blue shimmer moving slowly above the waves before vanishing. While most dismissed it as an atmospheric effect, a few investigators entertained the possibility of a natural but poorly understood phenomenon, perhaps something akin to ball lightning that could disorient or even damage a ship's electronics. But such an explanation still failed to account for the complete lack of debris. In the weeks that followed, families of the passengers held vigils along the coast, leaving flowers and candles at the water's edge. Many refused to believe their loved ones had drowned, clinging instead to the hope that they had been taken somewhere, by whom or what no one could say. Rumours even circulated that the Balaya Zvezda had been spotted hundreds of kilometres away in Turkish waters, crewless and drifting, but these reports were never confirmed. Each supposed sighting evaporated into hearsay before authorities could act on it. Maritime experts brought in to review the case pointed out that the Black Sea, despite its generally calm surface, holds layers of water with drastically different chemical compositions. Deep below, oxygen-deprived waters preserve sunken ships for centuries. Theoretically, a sudden sinking could hide a vessel almost immediately from view, but such an event would require catastrophic hull damage, and there was no sign in the yacht's final radio messages that anything of the sort had happened. Without distress calls or floating debris, the sinking theory felt incomplete. Complicating the story was the fact that the yacht's captain was no novice, but a man deeply familiar with the Black Sea's shifting moods. Friends described him as cautious to the point of superstition, unwilling to take unnecessary risks with weather or unknown waters. The thought that he could have led his crew and passengers into danger without warning seemed entirely out of character, making the absence of a mayday signal even harder to explain. Months turned into years, and the Balaya Zvezda faded from headlines, remembered mostly by locals who still looked out to sea and wondered. Some whispered that the yacht had stumbled into a strange patch of water where currents and fog concealed it from the world, while others spoke of otherworldly possibilities, places beyond sight or reason where ships go but do not return. Whether grounded in reality or spun from imagination, these theories reflected the unease that lingered over the coast. To this day, the location of the Balaya Zvezda's final signal shows nothing but open water. Boats pass over the spot daily, their crews often unaware that beneath them lies a mystery untouched since that hazy August afternoon. For those who still remember, the unanswered questions remain heavier than the water itself. How could a yacht vanish in clear daylight, leaving not a scrap behind? And perhaps more troubling, if it happened once, could it happen again? The St. Louis Time Tunnel. For the team of city workers in St. Louis, the project was expected to be routine, mapping land due for redevelopment. The neighbourhood had seen better days, and much of it was littered with abandoned warehouses and boarded-up storefronts. On a cold morning in 2003, the crew moved through an empty lot near the river, their boots crunching over gravel and broken glass, until they noticed a rusted metal hatch partially concealed beneath a mound of dirt. Thinking it might be an old utility access point, they forced it open, releasing a wave of stale air that smelled faintly metallic, as though it had been trapped for decades. Once inside, the men expected to find little more than narrow concrete tunnels or perhaps old maintenance corridors, but what stretched out before them was unlike anything they had seen. A long passageway extended into the distance, its walls lined with perfectly smooth panels that seemed too modern for a structure buried so deep and in such a forgotten part of the city. The lighting was dim but oddly even, with a faint bluish glow coming from strips embedded along the ceiling, yet no wires were visible, and the fixtures themselves appeared seamless, as if moulded directly into the walls. The temperature was strangely stable, neither cold nor warm, and there was no sign of dust or debris despite the entrance being sealed for who knew how long. Exploration became both exciting and unnerving as the crew continued forward, their footsteps echoing with a peculiar delay that made it feel as though the sound was bouncing back from an impossible distance. The hallway curved slightly to the left, and with each step they took, the hum of some unseen machinery seemed to grow louder, though no moving parts could be seen. At one point they came across a heavy door with no handle, only a small rectangular panel that lit up faintly when they approached. Out of curiosity, one of the workers touched it, and the door slid open without a sound, revealing a chamber that felt wrong in ways none of them could easily explain. The room's interior showed no corners at all. Its walls curved smoothly into the ceiling and floor, giving it an almost organic feel. In the centre stood a large ring-shaped structure mounted on a platform, its surface marked with intricate grooves and patterns that pulsed with faint light. The air within the room seemed thicker, as if it had weight, and time itself felt strangely sluggish, with movements seeming to lag behind their intentions by the tiniest fraction of a second. One of the men remarked that his wristwatch had stopped ticking entirely the moment they stepped inside, while another noticed that the second hand on his watch began to move backwards for a few moments before halting altogether. When they decided to turn back, something seemed different about the hallway they re-entered. The curve they remembered was now in the opposite direction, and the bluish lighting appeared dimmer than before. A faint vibration ran through the floor, and distant sounds, like muffled voices, could be heard echoing from somewhere deep within the passage. By the time they reached the hatch again, the opening to the surface appeared smaller, as if the shaft had subtly shifted shape. Emerging into the cold daylight, they were startled to find the lot around them looking off. The boarded-up buildings they had seen earlier now had unbroken windows, some with curtains, and the rusted cars along the curb were replaced by models they didn't recognise. One man swore that a sign on the corner now bore the name of a business that, to his knowledge, had closed down more than 30 years earlier. Another noticed that the air smelled fresher, lacking the industrial tang it had carried that morning. A passing bus rumbled by, but the design was unfamiliar, painted in colours none of them had ever seen used for the city's transit system. None of them wanted to linger, and after a few uneasy glances at one another, they left the lot in silence, agreeing to report the find only to their supervisor. When the crew returned the next day with city officials, the hatch was gone. The mound of dirt where it had been was undisturbed, as though nothing had been moved in decades, and the surrounding lot looked exactly as it had before they had first entered it. Boarded windows, rusted cars and all. The strange bus and the unfamiliar business were nowhere to be seen. Most of the officials brushed it off as a misunderstanding or a case of workers stumbling into an ordinary basement and letting their imaginations run wild. But among the crew, the memory of what they saw was too vivid to dismiss, and the changes they had noticed above ground were too specific to ignore. Beneath the noise of the city, the St. Louis time tunnel persisted in the memories of the crews who knew the tunnels best. Some claimed to have heard about similar tunnels being found and quickly sealed off, often with no explanation given beyond vague safety concerns. A few urban explorers tried to locate the site, but none could find any trace of the hatch or the smooth panel corridors described by the workers. Theories began to form, ranging from secret Cold War experiments to remnants of an advanced but forgotten technology buried beneath the city. Persistent talk described the tunnel as a place where time lost its rules, flowing in strange directions or splitting into other versions of events. The reports of changed streets and altered buildings fit neatly into this idea, though skeptics pointed out that memories can be unreliable, especially when people are primed to notice oddities. Yet the watches that stopped or ran backward remained an unsettling detail, one that was harder to explain away without invoking something extraordinary. Fringe researchers would later link the account to similar time-slip stories from other cities, where witnesses claimed to step into another period before returning. In some of these accounts, clothing styles, vehicles, and even the language on street signs seemed out of place, just as the St. Louis workers had described. But unlike those fleeting street-level encounters, the time tunnel hinted at something far larger and more deliberate. An engineered space, hidden underground, with a device at its heart that might have been responsible for whatever temporal distortion occurred. The hatch's whereabouts remain a mystery over 20 years on, with no guidance found in the city's redevelopment archives. The lot itself has been paved over and now serves as a parking area for a nearby warehouse, with no sign that anything unusual ever lay beneath it. Those who know the story still wonder if the tunnel is still down there, sealed away and waiting, its ring-shaped device quietly humming in the dark. And if it is, they wonder whether stepping inside again would lead them back to their own time, or somewhere else entirely. The vanishing fishing fleet of Lake Michigan. The surface of Lake Michigan has long been a stage for stories of tragedy and mystery, but few tales unsettle as deeply as the accounts of fishing fleets that seem to vanish without leaving a single trace. Generations of fishermen who braved the waters spoke of sudden storms, odd silences, and vessels that set out with confidence, only to be swallowed by an unseen force, never to return. For communities that depended on the lake, the disappearances were more than chilling stories. They were wounds carved into families and towns, with no answers to soften the loss. On one morning in the late 19th century, an entire cluster of small fishing boats departed from a harbour along the Wisconsin shore. The men aboard were familiar with the lake's moods, hardened by years of working against its waves and winds. The weather forecast offered no hint of trouble, and the fleet was expected to return by dusk with their nets heavy with perch and whitefish. Yet as the day stretched into night, The families waiting on the docks saw only empty waters. Not a single vessel came back, and no debris washed ashore in the days that followed. Search efforts were organised quickly, with neighbouring towns lending boats and manpower to scour the lake. They covered every likely route, scanning the horizon and peering into coves where wrecks might have drifted. Despite their determination, there was nothing to find. Not a piece of wood, not a fragment of netting, not even an oar. The rescuers returned with empty hands, and rumours began to swirl that something unnatural had claimed the fleet. For fishermen, whose lives already balanced on the edge of danger, the idea of an invisible hazard hiding beneath the surface became almost unbearable. As time passed, more accounts of disappearing boats were whispered along the shoreline. Some told of lone survivors who claimed their fellow crew members were pulled away by currents so strong they seemed impossible, or that a sudden wall of fog separated them from the others until they were adrift and alone. Others mentioned flashes of light beneath the water, or heard low sounds like thunder coming from the depths. While such tales could easily be dismissed as exaggerations born from grief or fear, they were repeated often enough to plant a lingering suspicion that the lake itself was holding secrets. One of the most unsettling incidents took place in the 1920s, when a small fishing company operating out of Muskegon lost 3 vessels in a single outing. According to local reports, the fleet had radio contact early in the morning confirming calm conditions and steady progress. By afternoon, however, all signals had gone silent. When searchers arrived the following day, the fleet was gone, and the only clue was a single floating life preserver, unmarked and without damage. For investigators, the lack of wreckage was more perplexing than the loss itself, as boats typically leave behind splintered remains after storms or collisions. Lake Michigan was no stranger to accidents, especially in eras when navigation relied more on instinct than instruments. But in these particular disappearances, there were no storms, no evidence of collision, and no witnesses to explain what unfolded. Newspapers covering the stories often hinted at the supernatural, describing the lake as cursed or suggesting that the fishing fleets had entered some kind of hidden void. Scientists and officials dismissed these notions, yet they could not offer a satisfying explanation, which only fueled the unease in the fishing towns. Fishermen who continued working the lake adjusted their habits, avoiding certain regions rumoured to be dangerous. A stretch of water known informally as the Michigan Triangle, located between Manitowoc, Benton Harbor and Ludington, grew infamous as stories linked it to missing boats, unexplained lights and sudden compass failures. It became common for older fishermen to warn younger crews to steer clear of the area, even when fish were said to be plentiful there. The lake seemed to carry a memory of what had been lost, and its surface inspired a mixture of fear and respect. Curiosity and concern reached far past the fishermen themselves. Throughout the 20th century, recreational boats and even cargo ships were reported missing under strange circumstances in the same waters, but the fishing fleets remained at the heart of the legend, for their disappearances struck at the lifeblood of the communities that relied on them. These were not wealthy travellers or commercial operations with resources. They were families, often poor, who had no choice but to risk the lake for survival. When their boats disappeared, entire households were left adrift in grief and uncertainty. As decades rolled on, researchers attempted to apply science to the old legends. Some proposed that unusual weather patterns, like sudden downbursts of wind or rogue waves, could sink small boats so quickly that no wreckage remained. Others suggested powerful underwater currents might drag ships into deeper regions of the lake, hiding them beyond recovery. Geological studies even revealed areas of the lake bed where methane gas could erupt from below, creating bubbles large enough to reduce buoyancy and swallow vessels whole. These explanations sounded convincing on paper, but none could be directly tied to the vanished fleets. Despite modern technology, the lake has refused to give up its secrets. Sonar scans and diving expeditions have uncovered many shipwrecks from storms and collisions, but the boats of the vanished fishing fleets remain unaccounted for. It is as though they were erased from existence, taken in a way that left no trace for anyone to follow. The absence of closure has kept the old fears alive, and each retelling of the stories keeps the memory of the vanished men and their boats hovering just beneath the surface of the water. Families who once gathered on the shore to wait for fathers, brothers and sons never truly stopped searching the horizon in their minds. Even after generations passed, descendants remembered the names of the lost fishermen and carried their stories forward, speaking of them not as forgotten victims but as warnings of the lake's unfathomable power. Among those who know the lake best, there remains a quiet understanding that while its waters can be generous, offering fish into passage, they can also claim entire fleets without explanation, leaving only questions that ripple across time. The Edinburgh taxi ride to 1920. Under the veil of Edinburgh's evening fog, David Carmichael entered a black taxi by Princes Street, expecting a normal journey home from the library. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and coal smoke curling from chimneys of buildings that lined the city's streets like solemn sentinels. The cab's interior smelled faintly of leather and engine oil, familiar enough to soothe the tension in his shoulders, and the driver, a man in his late 50s with a neatly trimmed moustache, nodded politely as David settled into the back seat. Nothing in that moment suggested the journey would be anything but ordinary. As the taxi pulled away, David noticed the city outside beginning to blur in the fog, the gas lamps along the streets casting long, wavering shadows that made familiar landmarks look strangely distorted. At first, he thought the weather was playing tricks on his eyes, but then the driver spoke, his voice calm yet oddly distant, giving directions to a street that David did not recognize. When David glanced at the buildings passing by, he was startled to see architecture that seemed older, more ornate than anything he remembered along that route. Shop signs advertised goods and prices that felt anachronistic, using terms that had fallen out of use decades ago. A mix of curiosity and unease swept over David as he asked the driver if they had taken a wrong turn, but the man only smiled and kept driving silently. The streets grew narrower and quieter, cobblestones replacing asphalt beneath the taxi's tyres, and gaslight flickered in small windows, illuminating people in long coats and hats that belonged more to the early 20th century than 1983. David rubbed his eyes, certain he must be imagining it, yet the sensation of movement, the taxi's hum, the shifting shadows, the click of wheels on stones, remained vivid and undeniably real. The first encounter with the impossible came when the taxi passed a newspaper stand. The headlines were legible, and David remembered reading them in books, articles describing events from 1920. The stories spoke of political tensions, local crimes, and cultural happenings that had shaped the city in the aftermath of the First World War. For a brief moment, David thought he had been transported through time, or perhaps into some hyper-realistic reenactment, but the pedestrians around him moved naturally, pausing at shop doors and conversing in voices tinged with accents unfamiliar to his modern ears. A feeling of weight pressed against David's chest as he realized that the driver, who had not once looked at him, seemed to guide the taxi with certainty through streets that should not have existed in the present. Horses occasionally clopped past, pulling carts loaded with crates and barrels, and the distant chiming of clock towers struck differently than any he knew. He tried to speak again, asking questions about landmarks or directions, but his words seemed to dissolve in the thick foggy air, and the driver only nodded or gestured subtly with a hand. The taxi stopped in front of what appeared to be a theatre, advertising a play that had premiered decades before David was born. Posters hung in the windows, their edges curled with age, and a small crowd gathered on the steps, dressed in fashion he could only describe from photographs and history books. The air was alive with a hum of conversation, and even the faint aroma of coal and bread from nearby shops carried him further into the sensation that he'd stepped into another time entirely. For a moment he wondered if leaving the taxi would anchor him in this strange past, or if it would vanish like a dream if he dared step outside. David's sense of dislocation grew when the vehicle continued down the street, passing familiar locations that were now unrecognizable. Buildings that should have been modern office blocks were replaced with brick facades and wrought iron railings. Streetlights were gas-powered, and the noise of trams clattering along tracks was a constant reminder that the city he knew had shifted into another era. He noticed a young boy in the distance carrying a bundle of newspapers, and even the typography on the pages matched what he had seen in archives from 1920. His mind struggled to reconcile what he was witnessing with the Edinburgh he knew, and the rational part of him tried to dismiss it as an elaborate set or hallucination brought on by fatigue. By now, David was both terrified and fascinated. He leaned forward, trying to catch the driver's attention, but the man remained enigmatic, his face calm and steady, as if guiding him through an experience he'd seen countless times before. The taxi turned into a narrow alley, lit by a single gas lamp that flickered intermittently. The walls of the buildings pressed closer, and the sound of the engine seemed muffled, replaced by the faint echo of footsteps and voices from unseen corners. Time itself felt suspended, the usual cadence of reality warped in the dim light and dense fog. At one point, the taxi passed a small pub, its windows fogged with condensation, and David caught a glimpse of a gathering inside. Men and women laughed quietly over drinks, wearing clothes he could identify from old photographs of post-war Edinburgh. A young couple danced in a corner, and for a fleeting moment David felt a pang of longing, as though he had stepped into a memory that was not his own but, somehow, intimately familiar. The world outside the taxi felt alive and ordinary, yet he knew it could not be so. The driver finally slowed the vehicle near a familiar modern landmark, a street that now looked consistent with the Edinburgh of his own time. As the taxi rolled to a stop, the fog seemed to lift slightly, revealing the shapes of cars and street signs that David recognized. When he stepped out onto the pavement, the chill of the modern evening hit him fully, and the air smelled of petrol and asphalt rather than coal and stone. Turning back, he could see the taxi pull away into the night, fading into the mist as if it had never been there. In the weeks that followed, David recounted the journey to friends and colleagues, but few believed him. Some suggested sleep deprivation or stress had played tricks on his mind, while others accepted only the possibility of a vivid dream. Yet David knew what he'd experienced, down to the smallest details: the smell of the air, the sound of cobblestones under tyres, the look of the people on the streets, and the subtle hum of the taxi's engine as it guided him through a city that had long been gone. The memory remained vivid, haunting his thoughts whenever he walked through Edinburgh, as though the streets themselves held a secret that ordinary perception could not capture. Some nights, when the fog rolled in thick from the Firth of Forth, David swore he could feel the faint vibration of the taxi beneath his feet and hear the echo of horse-drawn carts clattering over cobblestones. He never returned to that part of the city alone, but he knew that the Edinburgh he had ridden through that night still existed somewhere, hidden in time, waiting for another traveller to stumble upon it. The Great Eastern Railway Anomaly. The morning mist clung heavily to the tracks at Liverpool Street Station as commuters hustled to catch their trains, unaware that one particular service would soon become a story told in whispers for decades. On September 3rd, 1924, the Great Eastern Express, a train scheduled to depart for Norwich at precisely 8:15 a.m, was unusually crowded, passengers standing shoulder to shoulder in the carriages, briefcases clutched tightly, newspapers tucked under arms. Among the travellers were businessmen, families visiting relatives, and a few students eager to return to their universities, all expecting nothing more than the routine rhythm of British rail travel. The train left the platform on time, its engine chugging steadily as it accelerated out of the city, the familiar clatter of wheels on rails blending with the morning chatter. Witnesses along the tracks recalled seeing the locomotive glow in the early sunlight, steam rising in rhythmic bursts, and the cars lined up perfectly, each window reflecting the excitement of travellers eager to reach their destinations. For the first several miles, the journey appeared ordinary, unremarkable, and perfectly routine. A little over an hour into the trip, near the outskirts of Essex, the train encountered a sudden, inexplicable fog. It was thick, unnatural, and seemed to distort the surroundings, muting sounds and making the edges of trees and buildings appear hazy and indistinct. Passengers reported an immediate shift in the air, a sense of stillness that did not match the movement of the train. Conversations faltered as everyone instinctively peered out of the windows, trying to make sense of the shifting landscape, yet the tracks ahead seemed to vanish into a grey void. By the time the train approached the village of Marks Tay, conductors began to notice that the usual mile markers were no longer visible, and the landscape seemed unfamiliar, though the map should have confirmed they were on a familiar route. Passengers felt an increasing unease, some whispering nervously while others stared out blankly, unable to recognize the surroundings. Oddly, the rhythmic clatter of the train remained unchanged, yet it seemed disconnected from the visual cues around them, as though the world outside was slightly lagging or out of sync. Reports from those aboard describe a sudden shift in light, a muted quality as if the sun had dimmed momentarily, making the interior of the train glow in a softer, almost golden tone. One woman recalled that her pocket watch had stopped and then started again hours later, with the hands pointing to a time she could not reconcile with her memory. Attempts to speak with the train staff yielded only calm reassurances. The engineers insisted everything was normal, yet their own faces betrayed subtle confusion, and some whispered to one another in tones that passengers could not understand. When the train finally emerged from the fog, the passengers were stunned. The station they arrived at bore a different name, and the architecture seemed older, simpler, as though they had stepped back in time. Street lamps were gaslit instead of electric, and carriages along the adjacent streets were drawn by horses rather than powered by motors. Newspaper stands displayed editions dated decades earlier, and advertisements offered goods at prices that no one alive in 1924 would have recognized. A silence fell over the train cars, broken only by whispered disbelief and the clinking of luggage as it shifted with the sudden stop. Some travellers ventured cautiously outside, stepping onto the platform in disbelief. Locals on the station's edge seemed oblivious to the train's unusual arrival, going about their business as if the world had always been as it appeared. Confused conductors attempted to reconcile schedules, checking timetables and station logs, but nothing matched. The official records did not account for a train arriving at that station on that day. Passengers tried to ask questions, but the residents responded with puzzled expressions, speaking in words and terms that were archaic yet unmistakably English, as though pulled directly from early 20th century dialects. Time itself appeared warped during the event. Those who had been travelling for what felt like a normal morning reported subjective durations that did not make sense. Some passengers insisted the journey had lasted only 2 hours, while station clocks suggested closer to 5. Items carried by the travellers, watches, newspapers, letters, seemed to experience subtle changes. Ink faded unnaturally, watch hands spun for no reason, and a few belongings exhibited minor discoloration. For the first time, the passengers grasped that something extraordinary had occurred, but the scale and mechanism of the anomaly remained completely beyond explanation. As soon as the train was back on its scheduled route, the fog cleared just as quickly as it had descended. The landscape returned to familiar tracks. The mile markers were once again visible, and the usual stations appeared in their expected sequence. Passengers and crew struggled to describe what had happened, and for many the memory was accompanied by a strange sense of disorientation, as though their minds had recorded 2 overlapping realities. Attempts to report the anomaly to railway authorities were met with skepticism, and official records make no mention of the unusual detour, leaving the experience in a grey area between fact and rumour. Historians later found passenger diaries and letters referencing the event, all describing the same unsettling sensations: the fog, the archaic station, the distorted sense of time, and the eerie calm among residents who seemed oblivious to the impossibility of the situation. Modern researchers theorize that the anomaly may have involved a combination of atmospheric conditions and unexplained temporal distortions, though no definitive explanation has ever been confirmed. Even experienced railway workers, some of whom recorded accounts of the day, expressed uncertainty, emphasizing that the tracks and equipment had functioned flawlessly, leaving only the human perception of the impossible as the primary evidence. Through the years, the story of the Great Eastern Railway anomaly has gained a place in local legend, whispered about by enthusiasts and historians alike. The event illustrates how even the most structured and predictable systems can intersect with unexplainable phenomena, reminding witnesses and future generations that time and reality may not always follow the rules they expect. Those who travelled on the train often reported recurring dreams, in which the fog and the old station reappeared, suggesting that the experience had left an imprint on memory itself. Efforts to uncover corroborating evidence, including official logs or local testimonies, have proven fruitless, with only first-hand accounts and diaries hinting at the incident. Many scholars point out that without material evidence, the event must remain classified as an anomaly, yet the consistency of descriptions across multiple witnesses lends it a weight that cannot be easily dismissed. For the passengers, the day remains etched in memory, a journey that began like any other, but veered into a moment when the ordinary world gave way to something utterly inexplicable. That stretch of track, where the fog first showed itself, remains wrapped in understated superstition among local operators. Those who pass the route in the early mornings speak quietly of strange lights and distorted echoes of wheels, though none have seen anything as vivid as the passengers of 1924 described. The anomaly stands as a reminder that beneath the regular cadence of schedules and timetables, reality itself may bend, and time can play tricks so convincing that even those who know it best are left questioning what they witnessed. The Cessna 210 sky jump. Basking in the morning sunlight, the aluminum fuselage of the Cessna 210 gleamed on the tarmac at Boulder Municipal Airport, ready for a routine training flight over the Colorado Rockies. On June 14, 1987, pilot Alan Whitman, a seasoned aviator with over 15 years of experience, checked the instruments carefully while his student Mark Reynolds fastened his seatbelt. The day promised clear skies and mild winds, perfect conditions for basic maneuver training, and neither man could have predicted that the flight would soon defy every expectation of logic and safety. Once airborne, the Cessna climbed steadily above the city, the engine's hum blending with the whistling wind outside the open windows. Whitman guided the plane along familiar routes, practicing standard turns and altitude adjustments, while Reynolds observed the instruments, noting fuel levels and heading. The Rockies rose beneath them like a jagged sea of stone, their peaks dusted with lingering snow, and the sunlight cast long shadows across the valleys. It was a routine flight in every sense, and both men were comfortable with the rhythm of takeoff and ascent. At roughly 12,000 feet, while crossing the Front Range near Estes Park, Whitman decided to demonstrate a standard stall recovery maneuver. He gradually reduced engine power and pitched the nose upward, preparing to guide the aircraft back to level flight. Reynolds felt the familiar lift and drop, the slight shudder of the plane as airspeed dropped, yet the expected resistance and control feedback never arrived. Instead, the horizon appeared to stretch and blur, and the mountains below seemed to shift in unusual ways. Whitman's hands gripped the yoke tightly, a growing tension settling over him, as he realized that the familiar landscape had subtly altered. Within moments, clouds that had been scattered and distant thickened rapidly, forming an opaque wall around the plane. The sunlight dimmed to an eerie, diffuse glow, and shadows across the cockpit shifted unnaturally. Both men could feel the pressure change inside the cabin, yet the altimeter barely moved, reading the same altitude despite the sensation of rising and falling. Reynolds reached for the radio, expecting to hear routine chatter, but only static answered, punctuated by occasional bursts of unintelligible crackling. A cold unease settled over them as the plane drifted into an environment that felt simultaneously high above and strangely suspended. Suddenly, the terrain beneath them transformed. The familiar contours of Colorado's peaks and valleys seemed replaced with flat patchwork fields, and a haze of green and brown stretched into the distance in ways they could not have imagined. Whitman banked sharply, attempting to navigate back to recognizable landmarks, but each turn brought only more unfamiliar sights. Rivers flowed in unnatural curves, and forests appeared in precise geometric patterns, as though the world below had been rearranged. Both men began to question whether the instruments were failing or if some extraordinary phenomenon had taken hold of reality itself. As the flight continued, time appeared to shift. Whitman glanced at his watch and saw the hands spinning rapidly, moving forward and backward in a blur. Reynolds noted that his altimeter and airspeed indicator showed fluctuating readings, sometimes jumping in sudden increments. The plane's engine, though steady in sound, seemed to hum at a frequency that made the cabin feel alive, almost sentient. Neither man spoke at first, stunned by the experience. But then Reynolds broke the silence, asking in a trembling voice if Whitman had ever seen anything like it. Whitman shook his head, focusing on controlling the plane while desperately trying to make sense of the shifting sky and terrain. Moments later, the Cessna passed through a strange glittering haze, almost like a mirage, through which cityscapes of a bygone era became faintly visible. Roofs were tiled in red clay, streets were narrow and winding, and automobiles of a style long outdated moved along the roads. For a fleeting second, it seemed as though the aircraft had passed over a different time entirely, a version of the world decades earlier, before the urban sprawl had reshaped the landscape. Both men were too stunned to speak, and even the plane's usual vibrations felt muted, as if the atmosphere itself had become thicker, slower, and dreamlike. After what felt like hours, yet could have been only minutes, the plane emerged back into recognizable Colorado skies. The mountains and valleys had returned to their proper positions, the clouds dispersed, and the radio crackle resumed normal communication with air traffic control. Whitman adjusted the plane's altitude and heading, guiding them toward the airport as his hands trembled slightly from the intensity of what had just occurred. Reynolds exhaled a long, shaky breath, noting that the sun was still high and that the temperature inside the cabin felt warmer, as though the anomalous area they had flown through had existed outside the normal rules of climate as well. Upon landing, the men were met by airport personnel, who noted that no time had passed beyond the expected duration of the training flight. Whitman and Reynolds reported the unusual conditions and the disorienting visual anomalies, yet air traffic control and fellow pilots could not confirm anything out of the ordinary. No weather patterns indicated turbulence or unusual cloud formations, and radar showed nothing that could account for the distortions. The event was recorded in the flight logs, but many dismissed it as pilot error or misperception, though Whitman and Reynolds knew otherwise. During the weeks that followed, both men recounted the incident repeatedly, trying to understand what had happened. They spoke of shifting landscapes, an altered perception of time, and a feeling that they had traversed not only space, but something akin to temporal boundaries. Attempts to recreate the flight produced normal results, and the anomalies could not be reproduced, leaving the men with an experience that defied explanation. Friends and colleagues offered theories ranging from optical illusions to temporary disorientation, yet the vivid details of the shifting terrain and time anomalies were undeniable in their minds. Later investigations suggested that certain atmospheric conditions, combined with magnetic anomalies in the Rockies, could produce illusions or affect instruments, but no scientific explanation accounted for the vivid, prolonged experience described by Whitman and Reynolds. The Cessna 210 sky jump, as it came to be called in aviation circles, became a story of legend among local pilots, a cautionary tale about the unknown forces that might linger in the sky above even the most familiar landscapes. Across the same stretch of the Rockies, modern pilots sometimes report fleeting sensations of disorientation or glimpses of unusual terrain, though few have experienced anything approaching what Whitman and Reynolds described. For the two men, the memory remains vivid, a reminder that the skies above our world may conceal mysteries that cannot be charted on maps, predicted by instruments or explained by logic, leaving travelers suspended in a moment that feels both real and impossibly out of time. The Battle of Mons Ghost Soldiers. As dawn broke over Mons, Belgium, mist clung to the fields, and the first light of August 23, 1914 struggled to pierce the haze, while soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force moved cautiously along the familiar landscape, preparing for what would become the first major engagement between British and German forces during the Great War. Private Thomas Ellison, a young infantryman barely 20 years old, adjusted his helmet and tightened his grip on his Lee Enfield rifle, nerves coiling with anticipation and fear. The tension in the air was palpable, and every rustle of grass or distant clatter of hooves seemed amplified in the foggy silence. Reports of advancing German troops filtered through the ranks, and the commanding officers ordered positions to be fortified along the canal. Ellison and his comrades dug shallow trenches, hoping the limited cover would be enough to hold back the enemy's superior numbers. As they worked, the fields seemed almost frozen in time, the early morning mist obscuring the distant tree line and making the familiar Belgian landscape appear strange and foreboding. Conversations were quiet, punctuated only by whispered orders, as if the soldiers instinctively feared disturbing forces beyond the physical threat of war. Suddenly, some men in the ranks began pointing, their voices trembling as shadows moved across the fields ahead. Figures appeared, soldiers in full British uniforms, advancing in formation, rifles at the ready. At first, relief washed over those on the front line, but the sense of reassurance quickly gave way to confusion. These figures were not part of their unit. They moved with precision and purpose, yet no orders had been given, and the terrain beneath their feet did not match where they should have been. Ellison watched, frozen, as the silhouettes crossed the open fields with uncanny speed, vanishing into the mist as quickly as they appeared. The battle commenced with the first volleys of gunfire, and the chaos of artillery and musketry filled the air. Ellison noticed that, amidst the smoke and noise, more soldiers seemed to materialize out of nowhere, appearing in gaps where reinforcements should have been delayed. Witnesses would later describe entire platoons marching across the fields, vanishing before engagement, or reappearing moments later to provide cover or support. The phenomenon baffled those present, as no new units had arrived, yet the soldiers' courage and coordination seemed bolstered by unseen hands. Ellison and a few others who had been near the edge of the fog recalled hearing commands that were not issued by any officer they knew, voices carried across the battlefield, clear and authoritative, guiding men to positions that prevented their lines from collapsing. Some of the younger recruits swore they glimpsed familiar figures from their barracks, men who had been wounded or absent that morning. Their movements were precise, almost ritualistic, and although they could not be touched or questioned, they inspired a mixture of awe and fear among those who witnessed them. As the day wore on, the British forces managed to hold their positions despite being heavily outnumbered, an outcome many considered improbable given the circumstances. Ellis noted that in key moments of the engagement, soldiers would appear where needed most, shoring up weak points or intercepting German advances. The enemy soldiers seemed unable to detect or understand these unexpected arrivals, giving the British an uncanny advantage. For those who'd fought alongside them, it became clear that something extraordinary had intervened, though the explanation remained elusive. Witnesses would later describe how the figures moved with an otherworldly smoothness, unaffected by the rough terrain, smoke and chaos around them. Their rifles seemed to fire in unison with those of the present soldiers, yet they left no footprints, no tracks in the mud, and no physical evidence of their presence. Ellison and others spoke of seeing shadows linger on distant hills long after the fog had lifted, only to vanish as if they had never existed. The accounts spread among the troops, forming whispered stories of ghostly reinforcements that had helped turn the tide of the battle. Ellison himself recounted the moment he nearly reached out to one of the figures, a sergeant moving ahead of him with a determined stride. As his hand extended, the man seemed to dissolve into the morning mist, leaving only the outline of a shadow and the faint echo of footsteps that did not belong to anyone in his unit. The young private stumbled backward, heart pounding, realizing that these ghost soldiers were neither enemy nor friend in any conventional sense. They were something else entirely, an unknown presence woven into the fabric of the battlefield. The phenomenon was not limited to Mons alone. Subsequent reports from soldiers across Europe described similar occurrences, unseen reinforcements, fleeting figures in uniform, and inexplicable guidance during critical engagements. Yet Mons remained the most detailed and striking example, where dozens of men independently reported seeing and interacting with these apparitions. Diaries, letters, and post-war interviews consistently referenced the presence of soldiers who seemed to arrive from another time or plane, aiding the living without leaving tangible evidence behind. Following the battle, both historians and military analysts worked to reconcile these stories with documented troop movements, but none matched the ghostly soldiers. Officers who reviewed reports expressed skepticism, yet they could not fully dismiss the consistency of descriptions across multiple witnesses. Some suggested mass hallucinations caused by stress, fatigue, and the fog, but for the men who fought at Mons, the experiences felt undeniable and permanent, leaving an imprint on memory that could not be erased. Ellison often returned to the fields in his mind, imagining the mist rising over the canal, the sound of rifle fire mixing with the eerie silence of unseen formations, and the sense of guidance from soldiers who were present yet absent. Even decades later, veterans spoke of recurring dreams where the phantom figures reappeared, marching across empty fields and disappearing before engagement. The phenomenon was described not as threatening, but as protective, a spectral reinforcement that ensured survival in a situation that should have been overwhelming. For historians and paranormal researchers alike, the Battle of Mons presents an extraordinary case of unexplained wartime intervention. The ghost soldiers' presence defies conventional understanding of physics, military logistics, and time, leaving only the first-hand testimonies of those who witnessed them. Ellison's own recollections, preserved in letters to family and later interviews, emphasize the profound impact of the experience, where the ordinary horrors of war were intersected by something unexplainable and deeply moving. At the Mons battlefield, even modern visitors speak of a peculiar atmosphere, a quiet tension, and brief apparitions on the horizon when fog drifts across the fields. Military historians continue to debate the significance of these accounts, and while no physical proof has ever emerged, the legacy of the ghost soldiers endures. For those who were there, the Battle of Mons remains not only a story of bravery and strategy, but also a haunting encounter with forces beyond comprehension, a reminder that the past can sometimes intrude upon the present in ways that defy logic, leaving only memory and wonder in its wake. The Time Rift of Ocampo. On June 19, 1971, the sun hung low over Ocampo's plains as a convoy of delivery trucks carried goods between the regional market and outlying villages. Driver Manuel Rojas, a man in his early 40s with decades of experience navigating rural routes, hummed quietly to himself, the engine's steady vibration a comforting rhythm. Behind him, his assistant, Jorge Alvarez, checked the manifests, occasionally glancing out the window at the endless stretches of farmland that rolled by, dotted with cacti and adobe homes. Nothing about the day suggested that they were about to witness something entirely unexplainable. As the convoy passed a narrow gorge lined with jagged rocks, a sudden wind stirred violently, kicking up dust and bending the sparse vegetation along the roadside. Manuel slowed the lead truck, squinting against the glare of the setting sun, and noticed that the light ahead seemed distorted, almost like heat waves shimmering in an unusual pattern. Hawk pointed out strange silhouettes on the horizon, but the shapes disappeared as quickly as they appeared, leaving only an unsettling sense of movement in the air. Both men felt a sudden inexplicable chill, as though the temperature dropped by several degrees in an instant. The first oddity became impossible to ignore when the trucks entered a stretch of road that should have been familiar, yet the landscape seemed subtly altered. Hills were positioned slightly differently, and vegetation that should have been sparse was dense and overgrown. Manuel's instincts screamed that something was wrong, but the road remained perfectly navigable, and the convoy moved forward cautiously, the engine hum masking the growing tension between the drivers. Shadows stretched unnaturally, bending over the asphalt in ways that defied the fading light. Suddenly a faint haze appeared ahead, thin and golden, rising from the ground like mist yet shimmering like glass. The air inside the trucks felt heavier, as if charged with energy, and the engines made a low, whining sound that neither man could identify. Horst tried to speak, but his words faltered when he realized the sound of his voice was distorted, echoing unnaturally. As they entered the haze, the scenery shifted completely. The hills and fields transformed into unfamiliar terrain, dotted with small stone structures that appeared centuries old, and dirt paths replaced the asphalt road they had been travelling. The drivers quickly noticed another anomaly: the local wildlife. Birds that should have been common to the region were replaced with species unfamiliar to both men, their calls sharp and almost mechanical. Insects crawled over the rocks and vegetation in patterns that seemed organised and deliberate. Manuel stopped the lead truck to assess the situation, his hands shaking slightly as he realised that every landmark he knew had vanished. The air smelled different, earthy, almost sweet, and he could feel an underlying hum that seemed to resonate through the metal frame of the vehicle. Moving along, the convoy passed villagers whose attire, plain tunics, worn sandals, looked as if it had stepped straight out of a history book. When the men tried to ask questions, the villagers responded in a language that was a mixture of archaic Spanish and indigenous dialects, unfamiliar yet vaguely intelligible. It became clear that the convoy had entered a temporal zone, a rift that had transported them into the past, though neither man could comprehend the mechanism behind it. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed in this strange environment. Manuel and Jorge navigated the altered terrain, careful to avoid startling the villagers, who seemed oblivious to the presence of the trucks. The sky had an unusual hue, a soft amber that made it difficult to gauge the passage of time, and the sun appeared lower or higher depending on subtle changes in perspective. Mechanical devices within the trucks began to behave unpredictably. Gauges fluctuated, compasses spun, and the radio emitted static and faint fragments of voices that sounded like whispers from another era. Along the route, a small river appeared, its waters sluggish yet crystal clear, flowing over centuries-worn stones. Manuel leaned out to examine it, noticing tools and wooden carts resting along the banks, abandoned yet perfectly preserved. He realized the river's path did not match any known map of the region, yet the flow was natural and uninterrupted. Jorge insisted they were trapped in a localized time distortion, and both men began to wonder if exiting the haze would return them to 1971. or if they might remain in this historical pocket indefinitely. As they proceeded, a sudden gust lifted the haze slightly, revealing mountains in the distance that were unmistakable landmarks, but rendered in a state that suggested decades of erosion had been reversed. Villages appeared and disappeared along the roadside, alternating between familiar ruins and fully intact structures. Manuel's heart raced as he understood that the convoy was passing through a time rift, a phenomenon that bridged the present with layers of the past, and that every mile carried them deeper into a version of reality that should not exist. Slowly the haze started to lift, revealing the landscape returning to the way it had been in 1971. The asphalt road returned, fields aligned with memory, and the distant mountains appeared weathered and recognizable once more. Both men exhaled in relief, though the memories of the altered past clung to them. They noted that only a fraction of the time had passed according to their watches, despite what felt like a journey that lasted for hours, deepening the sense of unreality. When they reached the village of Ocampo, locals were entirely unaware of any anomaly, and no trace of the earlier landscape or its inhabitants remained. Manuel and Jorge tried to recount the experience, but few believed them. Scientists and journalists who later examined the site found no evidence of structural changes or disruptions, leaving only the testimony of the drivers to suggest that a temporal rift had indeed existed. For the men, the memory was vivid. The glow of the haze, the ancient villages, and the sensation that the very air had carried them through time. In the decades that followed, the story of the Ocampo time rift became a cautionary tale among drivers and travellers in the region. People reported fleeting visions along the same stretch of road, flickering lights, unusual weather patterns, and the faint sensation of being watched. Manuel and Jorge remained convinced that they had experienced a true breach in the fabric of time, a localized anomaly that defied conventional science and logic. Their lives were forever marked by the day they traversed history without leaving the present, witnessing a world that should have been long gone yet existed in perfect clarity. At certain hours, the road near Ocampo seems to breathe differently, and those who pass it feel an inexplicable tug, as if reality itself has tilted under the low sun and restless wind. Shadows appear to move differently, and the roadside haze takes on a shimmer that hints at hidden layers of reality. The phenomenon remains unexplained, but for Manuel and Jorge, the memory of the time rift is as tangible as the roads they travelled and the trucks that carried them, a reminder that the ordinary world can conceal extraordinary mysteries waiting to be encountered by those willing to journey into the unknown. The USS Eldridge displacement. The USS Eldridge rested in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard on a humid morning in late July 1943, its grey hull glinting under the weak sunlight filtering through a patchy sky. Crew members moved along the deck, performing routine maintenance, checking equipment, and exchanging brief greetings. Lieutenant Commander James Smith oversaw the operations, ensuring the ship's systems were for the experiment scheduled in the coming weeks. The vessel itself seemed ordinary, yet what was about to unfold would defy every expectation of naval science and logic, leaving a legacy of stories that blurred the line between history and legend. Preparations for the experiment had been extensive and secretive. Scientists and engineers from the Naval Research Laboratory had installed specialized equipment, including massive generators designed to create intense electromagnetic fields along the hull. The crew was briefed on procedures but given minimal explanations, leading to nervous speculation and hushed conversations among sailors about the purpose and potential consequences of the trials. Many noted a palpable tension in the air, a sense that the ship itself was being charged with an energy beyond comprehension. On the morning of the experiment, July 22nd, the Eldridge was anchored in the Delaware River, and the deck thrummed with anticipation. Lieutenant Commander Smith supervised as engineers activated the generators, and the ship began to emit a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through every metal surface. Sailors reported a strange tingling sensation on their skin, a prickling that suggested static electricity, yet was more intense and penetrating than anything they had felt before. The hum grew louder, and the air around the ship shimmered slightly, like heat rising from asphalt in summer. Individuals who witnessed it describe a sudden, almost imperceptible distortion of the ship's outline as the electromagnetic fields intensified. Waves along the river reflected oddly against the hull, creating ripples that seemed disconnected from the motion of the water. Crew members struggled to focus, reporting a disorienting sense of vertigo and the fleeting impression that parts of the deck were disappearing or merging with the surrounding environment. Lieutenant Commander Smith called for caution, but the scientists urged continuation, eager to observe the effects as the machinery pushed the boundaries of known physics. Without warning, the Eldridge seemed to vanish completely, leaving behind only a faint shimmer where it had been. Sailors on board reported feelings of weightlessness and dislocation, objects floating or sliding across the deck without explanation. Those stationed at the shipyard observed nothing where the vessel had been moored, creating confusion and panic among dock workers and nearby personnel. Some described a ghostly mist hovering over the water, a thin, glowing haze that quickly dissipated, leaving the Eldridge seemingly gone. Moments later, accounts suggest that the ship reappeared, not in Philadelphia, but hundreds of miles away off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia. The sailors were disoriented, struggling to reconcile the sudden shift in location with their perception of time and space. Some claimed they had experienced flashes of light, sudden vertigo, and even brief unconsciousness. Equipment that had been monitored throughout the experiment registered erratic readings. Compasses spun wildly, and electrical systems flickered as if reality itself were fluctuating. The displacement appeared instantaneous, yet no instruments could definitively record the exact moment or duration of the anomaly. Several crew members reported witnessing fellow sailors appearing or disappearing in mid-air during the experiment, a phenomenon that was never officially documented. Lieutenant Commander Smith and other officers attempted to restore order, guiding the bewildered men to check the ship's systems and confirm stability. Some crew members described feeling physical strain, as if their bodies had been stretched or compressed, and others noted that certain objects had seemingly teleported from one area of the deck to another. The entire event left a lingering impression of unreality, as though the boundaries of space and time had been bent by forces beyond comprehension. Once the ship returned to its normal operational state, the crew was faced with the daunting task of accounting for the anomalies. Logs indicate that minor injuries occurred, ranging from temporary disorientation to unexplained burns, but no full-scale damage to personnel or equipment was recorded. Sailors struggled to describe their experiences to superiors, aware that their testimony would likely be dismissed as hallucination or stress-induced confusion. Yet, the consistency of reports among multiple crew members suggested something extraordinary had indeed taken place. Both public explanations and formal naval records attempted to minimize the significance of what had happened. The Eldridge was listed in routine operation logs without reference to the experiment or the alleged disappearance and reappearance. Researchers attempting to investigate the phenomenon decades later encountered conflicting records, missing documents, and inconsistent accounts from witnesses. The secrecy surrounding the operation added layers of mystery, leaving the event enshrouded in speculation and rumour, with only the first-hand accounts of those on board hinting at the true magnitude of what occurred. Eyewitnesses to the ship's displacement continue to describe the event in vivid detail. They recall the hum of the generators, the shimmer of the hull as it bent light, and the momentary sense of detachment from the world. Lieutenant Commander Smith reportedly never forgot the sensation of standing on the deck, watching the river vanish beneath the ship while being aware that time had not simply paused, it had stretched, folded, and shifted in ways impossible to measure. The memory of the event remained etched in the minds of all who survived, a haunting encounter with forces that science had yet to fully understand. As time went on, the story of the USS Eldridge evolved into a mixture of fact and legend. Testimonies from crew members, engineers, and observers described elements that could not be reconciled with conventional physics: instantaneous displacement, brief invisibility, and unexplained material distortions. Scientists hypothesized electromagnetic interference or experimental miscalculations, but these theories could not account for the consistent descriptions of sailors who experienced physical and sensory anomalies. The tale became a cautionary narrative about the potential dangers of tampering with forces that govern space and time. Though often dismissed as hearsay, reports of unusual phenomena on other World War II ships added layers to the legend of the Eldridge. Pilots, dock workers, and civilians occasionally reported sightings of ghostly ships or shimmering light patterns on the water, echoing elements described by those who witnessed the experiment firsthand. The legacy of the USS Eldridge became a touchstone in discussions of experimental physics, alleged teleportation, and time manipulation, a story that blurred the lines between military history and the unexplained. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, along with nearby naval sites, continues to draw those who follow the story, their curiosity tempered by caution. Researchers study electromagnetic phenomena and experimental propulsion with careful attention to historical accounts of the Eldridge, seeking rational explanations while acknowledging that some aspects of the event remain outside the scope of conventional science. For the sailors who experienced it, the displacement was an unforgettable encounter with the unknown, a moment in which the rules of reality themselves seemed suspended, leaving a legacy of wonder, fear, and speculation that endures decades later. The vanishing bus of Mexico City. The streets of Mexico City buzzed with activity on the evening of October 12, 1969, as a crowded urban bus made its usual route along Avenida de los Insurgentes, weaving past vendors, street lights, and the endless flow of cars. Passengers clutched straps and poles, some dozing after a long workday, others chatting quietly or reading newspapers, while the driver, Enrique Morales, expertly navigated the crowded avenues. Nothing about the route or the passengers suggested that this ordinary bus ride would soon become a baffling mystery that would be remembered for decades. As the bus approached the intersection near Plaza de la República, passengers noticed a strange stillness settle over the street. The usual hum of traffic seemed muted, and distant sounds of honking horns and shouting vendors were strangely faint. A few commuters exchanged puzzled glances, murmuring about the sudden quiet, while Morales instinctively slowed the vehicle, scanning the surrounding streets for any obstruction or unusual event. The city appeared to stretch unnaturally ahead, the familiar buildings elongated and shimmering in the dimming sunlight. At the same moment, a faint golden haze enveloped the bus as it continued along its route, just above the pavement, shimmering slightly against the concrete. Passengers began to feel an odd sense of weightlessness, as if the bus were no longer fully grounded, and the hum of the engine seemed to vibrate through their bodies in an unusual rhythm. Young children clutched their parents, frightened by the sensation, while older commuters looked around in confusion, trying to make sense of the sudden distortion of familiar surroundings. The first major anomaly became impossible to ignore when the bus passed under the shadow of the Torre Latino Americana. The street outside appeared to shift and change. Vendors' stalls were replaced with wooden carts and old-fashioned lamps, the asphalt seeming to revert to uneven cobblestones. Morales noticed that the traffic lights ahead, familiar in their modern design, had transformed into wrought iron lanterns. Passengers gasped quietly as it became clear that the city around them no longer resembled 1969, but a version of the past, as if the bus had slipped through a crack in time. Some passengers claimed to see pedestrians dressed in attire from decades earlier, men in suits and fedoras, women in long skirts and wide-brimmed hats, walking briskly along the sidewalks, yet not acknowledging the modern bus. A street musician played a violin nearby, producing music that seemed impossibly old-fashioned, yet eerily clear. Morales gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling the vehicle vibrate in ways that suggested it was partially detached from the road, and he struggled to maintain control as the landscape continued to morph around them. Conversations inside the bus became tense as whispers of disbelief spread. Jorge Herrera, a university student, pointed out that the newspaper he had been reading appeared altered, the headlines now in archaic typography reporting events from the 1930s. Older passengers claimed that their watches had stopped or were spinning backward. Some clutched each other in fear, believing that the bus might never return to its proper time. Morales tried to reassure them, though he himself felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down with every turn of the wheels. The bus passed by what should have been a familiar modern building, but instead saw an ornate theatre with gas lamps flickering along the facade. Passengers noticed horse-drawn carriages instead of cars and street vendors offering goods long out of production. A man at the back of the bus, a history professor named Luis Alvarez, began quietly taking notes, recognizing architectural details and street layouts from early 20th century maps. His calm, methodical observations contrasted with the rising panic of others, who could feel the reality of their surroundings slipping into something unrecognizable. One of the children pointed urgently, claiming to see a familiar figure from the past strolling along the sidewalk. The woman turned to look, her eyes widening in disbelief. But when the bus accelerated, the figure disappeared as if it had never existed. Morales focused on navigating, noticing that the bus seemed to be moving through layers of the city simultaneously. Streets from multiple decades overlapping in impossible ways, sounds of horses clopping against cobblestones mixed with distant car horns, producing an auditory dissonance that made the journey feel dreamlike yet terrifyingly real. For what felt like hours, the bus wound its way through streets that seemed to twist and change around it. Sunlight dimmed, creating long, distorted shadows along the streets. Morales noticed that some street signs bore names that had long been changed or removed, yet they appeared freshly painted and maintained. Commuters pressed against the windows, trying to identify landmarks, but every turn brought new anomalies, from buildings that flickered between modern and historical forms to pedestrians who appeared and vanished without warning. Finally, as the bus crossed what should have been the familiar intersection near the Zocalo, the haze began to lift. The streets solidified, the cobblestones giving way to asphalt, the gas lamps fading into modern streetlights, and pedestrians returned to contemporary attire. Morales exhaled, feeling the vibration of the engine normalize, as though the bus had returned to its proper time and place. Passengers stared out at the streets, some shaken, others in awe, struggling to reconcile the memories of what they had seen with the normalcy of their surroundings. Upon returning to the terminal, the bus was met with routine traffic and commuters unaware of any anomaly. Reports of the vanishing bus reached city authorities, though official records treated the incident as a possible hallucination, mass hysteria, or misreporting. Despite skepticism, first-hand accounts remained consistent, detailing the temporal slip with intricate details of architecture, clothing, and street life from earlier decades. Many passengers would recall the journey vividly for the rest of their lives, describing it as a brief but undeniable journey through a lost layer of the city's history. In the aftermath, locals and travellers alike eyed the vanished bus's route with a mix of apprehension and fascination. Drivers reported strange sensations and fleeting visual anomalies along the same stretch, with some claiming that the streets briefly resembled older versions of themselves before returning to normal. Urban historians and researchers later attempted to study the area, comparing old maps with current layouts, noting inexplicable coincidences and architectural alignments. Though no concrete scientific explanation emerged, the story of the vanishing bus became part of Mexico City lore, a cautionary tale about the city's hidden temporal fractures. Long after the events, witnesses described the eerie weightlessness, the streets glowing oddly, and the ghostly glimpse of a city that seemed to predate them. For Morales and the passengers, the journey was not a simple memory, but a lived experience of something that defied conventional understanding. A fleeting slip through time in the heart of one of the world's largest cities, leaving a lingering sense that reality is far more fragile and mysterious than anyone could imagine. The missing lighthouse keepers of Isle Moor. The North Atlantic winds battered Isle Moor on the morning of December 15, 1900, as the lighthouse stood defiantly against the churning grey sea, its white tower stark against dark clouds. Lighthouse keeper James McLeod checked the light's mechanism, ensuring the clockwork rotation remained steady, while his assistants Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur inspected the foghorn and supply stores. The island was isolated, accessible only by a small rowboat or a treacherous climb over jagged rocks, and the men were accustomed to the harsh conditions that seemed to define life in the Flannan Isles. The previous day's storm had subsided, leaving the island slick with rain and sea spray, and the men began routine maintenance. MacLeod noted the unusual quiet. No seabirds circled overhead, and the waves seemed lower than usual, their rhythm almost hypnotic. Marshall, younger and more observant, mentioned that the ocean had an odd shimmer, reflecting the sky in colours that seemed unnatural. MacArthur shrugged off the comments, but a shared unease lingered among the keepers, subtle but palpable, as if the island itself were watching and waiting. By evening the light had been properly adjusted, and the men prepared a simple meal. Thomas remarked that he had noticed footprints leading toward the cliff edge that neither he nor his colleagues recognised, prints that seemed fresh yet led nowhere. James laughed nervously, suggesting that the wind or waves might have disturbed old tracks, but even he felt a creeping tension settle over the room. Donald silently polished the brass fittings of the foghorn, his eyes lingering on the distant horizon as the sun dipped behind gathering clouds. The following morning, on December the 16th, the supply steamer Hesperus arrived to check on the lighthouse, bringing with it the first hint that something was wrong. Captain William Henderson reported that no smoke from the lighthouse's stove could be seen, and that the signal light had not been operated for more than a day. Upon docking and stepping onto the rocky shore, the crew found the lighthouse doors locked from the inside, yet eerily silent, with no sign of the three men. Inside, a chair was overturned, the clockwork of the light still running, and a perfectly laid table bore remnants of a meal that seemed recently abandoned. Searching the lighthouse revealed details that seemed impossible to explain. A set of oilskins and boots was neatly hung, ready for use, as if the men had left briefly with plans to return. The logbook, kept meticulously by MacLeod, contained entries up to the evening of December 15th, with the final note stating only that the weather was improving. Yet there were no signs of struggle, footprints leading away from the building, or evidence of a storm's interference. The Hesperus crew scoured the surrounding cliffs and rocky coastline, but the men had vanished without a trace, leaving only questions and an overwhelming sense of unease. The arrival of authorities marked the beginning of an inquiry that heightened the mystery rather than resolved it. Search parties combed the island over the next several days, noting that the waves lapped unusually quietly against the rocks, and some claimed to hear distant human-like voices carried on the wind, though no one was present. Investigators recorded that one of the large provision boxes had been opened and some supplies removed, yet the logic of the keeper's disappearance was not explained. Each new observation seemed to contradict another, weaving a tangled web of impossibilities. Sailors and fishermen came forward with testimonies that complicated the investigation. Several claimed they had seen strange lights around the lighthouse during the night of December 15th, small flickering orbs hovering just above the cliffs. Others reported hearing odd, dissonant whistles on the wind, notes that carried across the waves but did not resemble any human song or natural sound. These testimonies were consistent in their detail, despite the witnesses' lack of contact with each other, suggesting that whatever occurred had left an impression not just on the island, but on those who observed it from afar. Theories emerged quickly, ranging from plausible explanations to fantastical speculation. Some suggested the men had been swept away by rogue waves or dragged into hidden crevices along the cliffs, but the absence of debris or water damage made this unlikely. Others posited that a rare phenomenon, such as a sudden fog bank or temporary magnetic distortion, could have disoriented them, yet no concrete evidence supported these ideas. Each hypothesis only deepened the mystery, highlighting the impossibility of reconciling the men's disappearance with the facts left behind. Months later, a follow-up inspection of the lighthouse provided further strangeness. Items inside had shifted slightly, though no one had been present. Books had fallen from shelves, and a chair was again overturned, though not in a pattern consistent with human movement. Sailors passing the island at night reported the light appearing briefly and then extinguishing, despite the lighthouse being unmanned. Rumours spread among local communities, stories told by sailors and villagers alike of a phantom presence guarding the tower, a spectral echo of the vanished keepers wandering the cliffs. The psychological impact on those aware of the event was profound. Captain Henderson reportedly developed insomnia, haunted by memories of approaching the silent lighthouse and the impossibility of the men's disappearance. Searchers and authorities expressed an unspoken fear whenever their thoughts returned to the Flannan Isles, as if the place itself carried a weight beyond natural explanation. Even decades later, the case continued to capture imaginations, inspiring books, articles, and debates about the limits of human understanding when confronted with inexplicable events. Experts examining the disappearance emphasized the thorough record-keeping of MacLeod and the other lighthouse keepers. The logbook provided a rare glimpse into the men's last hours, revealing nothing of panic or forewarning, only routine observations and the final entry, which ended without any hint of danger. This stark normalcy makes the mystery all the more chilling. Men prepared for their daily tasks vanished, leaving behind not chaos but quiet, deliberate evidence of ordinary life suddenly interrupted. Legends grew over time, combining facts with myth. Fishermen spoke of ghostly keepers tending the lighthouse during storms, silhouettes visible against the moonlit sea, while others warned that the cliffs of Eileanmore seemed to draw people in with an almost magnetic force. Though modern science does not explain, the consistency of witness testimony and the physical details left behind continue to fuel speculation. The lighthouse stands today as both a functioning aid to navigation and a monument to one of the most enduring maritime mysteries in history. At present, visitors to the Flannan Isles report a strange sense of isolation and the faint impression that the lighthouse is occupied, though no one is present. Sounds of footsteps on the rocks, sudden gusts that seem deliberately directed, and the fleeting glimmer of light at odd angles have all been reported. The mystery of the missing keepers remains unsolved, a haunting reminder that even in the modern world some events resist explanation, leaving only questions, lingering unease, and the silent, watchful tower of Eileanmore as evidence of the unknown. The jogger on the Old Coach Road. The early morning mist hung low over the Old Coach Road on the outskirts of rural Devon, England, as Martin Fletcher set out on his usual jog on October 3rd, 1976. The narrow path, lined with dense hedgerows and ancient oaks, was slippery with dew, and the faint scent of damp earth mixed with the sharp tang of autumn leaves. Martin had run this route countless times, appreciating the solitude and the rhythmic crunch of his shoes against the gravel, but that morning carried an unusual stillness, a tension that he couldn't immediately identify. As he rounded a bend near the old stone bridge, Martin noticed a faint shimmer along the road ahead, like heat rising from cobblestones in summer, though the air was crisp and cold. He slowed his pace, curiosity mingling with unease, and saw a figure ahead, a man dressed in clothing unlike anything Martin had ever seen, a heavy wool coat with brass buttons and a bowler hat, carrying a wooden cane. The jogger's breath quickened as he realised the figure seemed almost frozen in place, yet there was a sense of movement, as though the man were both there and not there at the same time. Martin tried to call out, but his voice faltered, swallowed by the thick mist. The figure lifted its head slowly, revealing an expressionless face, eyes staring past him rather than at him. The jogger's instincts screamed to flee, yet his legs remained stiff, as if rooted to the path. He noticed the road itself seemed different, cobbled stones replacing the gravel he knew, the hedgerows taller and more tangled, and the oak trees appearing older, gnarled and twisted into unnatural shapes. Every familiar landmark had been subtly altered, transformed into a version of the road that could not exist in his time. The jogger's pulse raced as he moved cautiously closer, attempting to bridge the distance, yet the figure remained the same, unnervingly still. Martin noted small details, the brass buttons glinting faintly in the dim light, the worn leather of the man's shoes, and the smell of pipe smoke lingering in the air despite no fire visible. Something about the figure's presence felt overwhelmingly out of place, as if he had stepped directly from the pages of history into Martin's morning run. Martin's eyes widened when he realised the path behind the figure seemed to have shifted as well. Where he had expected the familiar bends and gravel, there were now shadows of horse-drawn coaches and travellers in top hats passing in the distance, their carriages clattering over cobblestones that should not exist in 1976. The sounds of hooves and wheels were clear, yet faint, like echoes from another dimension layered over the present. The jogger could feel the temporal dissonance pressing against his senses, an inexplicable tug pulling him toward the past. He stumbled slightly, regaining his balance, and attempted to speak again. The figure raised one hand slowly, a gesture neither threatening nor inviting, and then turned, moving down the road with a purposeful stride. Martin felt compelled to follow, though every step brought more questions than answers. As he pursued the man, the landscape continued to distort. The hedgerows thickened unnaturally, and mist swirled around the jogger's feet, obscuring the road and creating a tunnel-like effect that seemed to stretch endlessly. The jogger began to notice changes in the air itself. The temperature fluctuated unpredictably, alternating between the crisp autumn chill and a damp warmth reminiscent of late Victorian streets. Strange sounds accompanied these shifts, the distant clip-clop of hooves, the faint ring of a bell, and murmured voices speaking in accents and phrases unfamiliar to Martin yet oddly coherent. Birds that should have called from the trees remained silent, and an unnatural stillness settled over the environment, broken only by the rhythmic steps of the man ahead. By now, Martin was sweating despite the cool air, his heart pounding not from exertion but from the disorienting realization that the old coach road had been replaced with a living snapshot of another era. He tried to focus on familiar landmarks, the broken signpost, the leaning oak, but they had either vanished or transformed, replaced by features that belonged to a time decades before his birth. Every glance backward confirmed the impossibility. The road behind him appeared normal one moment, then shifted again as if layered with multiple temporal realities. The jogger's breathing became shallow as he drew closer to the figure, noticing now the small details that made the encounter surreal. Dust rose unnaturally around the man's shoes, and faint footprints lingered briefly on the cobblestones before vanishing entirely. A small dog trotted alongside one of the distant coaches, barking in a tone that faded the instant Martin tried to listen. It was as though the scene existed independently, adhering to its own rules of time and space while he intruded upon it. Martin reached a point where the figure paused near a bend in the road, silhouetted against the mist. The jogger could see more clearly now the era-specific details: a pocket watch dangling from a chain, a carefully pressed vest, and the polished shine of the man's walking cane. The figure looked back momentarily, though the expression remained vacant, neither welcoming nor hostile, and then moved forward again, vanishing into the thickening fog. Martin followed instinctively, and with each step the road behind him began to reassert its 1976 identity. Gravel replaced cobblestones, hedgerows thinned, and the familiar oak trees reappeared in their known positions. By the time he reached the final bend, the figure had disappeared entirely. Martin stood panting, staring down the road, the morning sun piercing through the dissipating mist. The jogger's mind raced to comprehend what had just occurred. The experience had lasted only minutes, yet every detail, clothing, architecture, sounds suggested a temporary but complete shift into another time. No one was in sight, and the old coach road looked exactly as it always had, ordinary and unremarkable, leaving Martin with nothing but the lingering sense that he'd glimpsed a world existing alongside his own. In the wake of the incident, Martin told friends and neighbours what he'd experienced, but skepticism was swift. Some suggested fatigue, hallucination or exaggeration, while others quietly admitted they had felt uneasy along that stretch of road themselves, describing fleeting shadows and glimpses of figures that vanished when approached. Martin returned to the old coach road multiple times, hoping for a recurrence, yet nothing appeared, though a subtle sense of tension seemed to cling to the path, as though the road remembered his presence. Soon, the story told by the jogger was woven into regional legends, intertwined with older stories of mysterious figures on the old coach road. Residents warned passing runners and walkers of fleeting apparitions and temporal anomalies, and the legend of the jogger who'd glimpsed another era persisted. Martin himself never again saw the figure, but the memory of that morning remained vivid, a haunting experience in which the boundaries of time and reality had seemed to dissolve entirely, leaving only questions and the quiet, lingering echo of a world from the past.